Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to assist you in drifting off to sleep. Before we begin, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time you're watching, so feel free to share that in the comments. Once you're ready, find a comfortable spot and unwind. There are mornings when I wake up, hoping it was merely a dreadful dream, a nightmare that will fade away with the morning light. I pause, anticipating the sound of her laughter or the light patter of her footsteps descending the stairs, but instead, a profound silence engulfs me like an impenetrable wall. My daughter, Elena, is simply gone, and the most agonizing part is not knowing the where, how, or why. Elena was my only child, my ultimate source of pride. I had dedicated my entire life to ensuring she had the opportunities I never did. When she was accepted into a college in a distant city, a blend of pride and apprehension settled in my heart. I worried about her being so far away, yet I believed she was prepared to conquer the world. It was a drizzly afternoon in March when I received the call. I had been at the workshop all day, surrounded by the clamor of hammers and the pervasive scent of grease. I almost didn't hear my phone ring. When I answered, the voice on the other end was tense, almost devoid of warmth. It was a police officer informing me that my daughter's car had been involved in an accident. My heart momentarily froze, but what he said next left me utterly immobilized. Elena was not in the vehicle. The car had been discovered overturned on a secluded road beside a ravine, one she frequently traveled to return to her apartment. I was too. Initially, the officers assumed her body would be close by, perhaps flung aside by the impact, yet there was no trace of her anywhere. There were no bloodstains, no footprints to suggest she had left on her own accord, nothing at all. I drove into town that same night, the rain seeming unending, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as my mind raced through every conceivable scenario. What if she had exited the car and was now injured, stranded in the storm? What if someone had arrived before the officers and taken her away? When I reached the accident scene, the patrol car's lights pierced the darkness like flashes of lightning. The car lay there, overturned and mangled, yet empty. I approached cautiously, as if I might still discover some sign of her presence. The windows were shattered, the seats smeared with mud, and the trunk remained shut. The rain had washed away everything in its path, obliterating any clues that might have lingered. The officers attempted to reassure me, promising they would do everything possible to find her, but their words felt hollow, almost robotic. There was no evidence of anyone else being involved, no extra tire tracks at the scene. It was as if Elena had simply vanished into thin air. Days went by, and the investigation moved at a sluggish pace. They reviewed security cameras in the vicinity, but the road was too remote, too isolated. There were no witnesses, no emergency calls related to the accident, except for the motorist who reported it hours later. I remained in his While the search persisted, the apartment felt vacant but for the lingering essence of her presence. It was a modest abode, adorned in a practical yet appealing style. Her books remained open on the table, and the cup of coffee she had left that morning still sat in the sink. Despite the apparent signs of her being, she was nowhere to be found. During one of my visits to the apartment, I stumbled upon something that unsettled me profoundly. While rummaging through her belongings, I discovered a notebook she used for jotting down thoughts, lists, and reminders. Among the pages, she had scribbled peculiar names and addresses I didn't recognize. These weren't places she had ever mentioned or people she had spoken before. I took these names to the police, but they informed me they held no significance to them. However, to me, they were a fragile thread I felt compelled to follow. One of the names was linked to an address near the site of the accident. Determined to uncover the truth, I resolved to investigate it myself. The address led me to a dilapidated old house on the town's outskirts. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was a tangle of overgrown weeds. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. As I circled the property, I noticed a narrow path winding into the woods. The rain had begun to fall again, but it didn't deter me. The path was slippery and twisting, yet it guided me to a shed hidden among the trees. Though it appeared abandoned, something inside drew my attention. There were marks on the ground as if someone had dragged something heavy, and I also found remnants of duct tape and an empty water bottle. Everything was shrouded in a thin layer of dust. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently. Returning to town, I was burdened with more questions than answers. I chose not to disclose my discovery to the police, knowing they wouldn't take me seriously. Instead, I decided to persist in my investigation, questioning those who lived nearby. Some mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars during the night, yet no one could provide concrete information. Weeks turned into months, and the official search went cold. Nevertheless, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Every night, I dreamed of Elena, her radiant smile, her infectious laughter, and each morning, I awoke to the profound void her absence left behind. One day, while sifting through the few belongings she left in her apartment, I stumbled upon something I had previously missed, a key ring with a small, unfamiliar key. I became consumed with finding its purpose. After weeks of fruitless searching, the answer finally came to me. It was the key to a locker at the bus station. Inside, I discovered a folder containing photographs, documents, and notes penned by Elena. She had been delving into something I still don't fully comprehend. The photos depicted faces of seemingly unknown individuals, but her notes detailed encounters, dates, and places. One note mentioned a man residing near the road where the accident occurred, and his name matched one I had found in her notebook. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I couldn't ignore this lead. I went to the address provided, ready for anything this time. It was a modest house, unremarkable at first glance. But when I knocked on the door, there was no response when I called out, so I peered through one of the windows and noticed that the interior appeared vacant, nearly abandoned. Determined to uncover anything that might bring me closer to Elena, I forced my way inside. What I discovered left me chilled. In one of the rooms, a board adorned the wall, covered with photographs. Some depicted unfamiliar faces, but others unmistakably featured Elena. There were images of her strolling down the street, entering her apartment, and even at the university. My body tensed with anxiety. Who had been observing her, and why? Before I could fully comprehend the situation, I heard the sound of an approaching car. I quickly dashed to hide behind a door, waiting silently. A man entered, engaged in a phone conversation. Although I couldn't discern his words, his demeanor was casual, as if nothing was amiss. However, when he stepped into the room with the photographs, his expression shifted. He realized someone had been there. I can't precisely recall how I managed to escape the house undetected, but I vividly remember the terror that gripped me. The realization that Elena was entangled in something far more significant than I had ever imagined. The police eventually took the findings seriously, but they were never able to link the man to her disappearance. The case remains unresolved, an unhealed wound. I continue the search every day and every night, regardless of the weather, because until I find answers, I can't stop wondering what happened to my daughter. Is she still alive? Is she in distress? Will I ever learn the truth? The rain was unyielding that night, a relentless curtain that. Darkness descended over the city, casting an even gloomier shadow as raindrops pounded relentlessly against the windshield while I navigated a secondary road on the outskirts. There was an unusual tension in the air, an inexplicable feeling that lingered. It was supposed to be a routine call. A neighbor had reported peculiar noises emanating from an old house at the end of a gravel path. According to the records, no one had resided there for years. Most likely, it was teenagers searching for a spot to drink or perhaps vagrants seeking refuge from the storm. I kept reassuring myself of this as I parked the patrol car in front of the property. The house resembled something straight out of a horror movie, with shattered windows and paint flaking off from years of neglect. Through the downpour, I could scarcely discern the outline of the building. Exiting the car, I adjusted the flashlight in my grip as the rain drenched my uniform within moments. The rusty iron gate yielded with a creak as I pushed it open. I advanced through the overgrown garden where weeds reached up to my knees. The front door was ajar, a detail that made my jaw tighten with apprehension. I had an unsettling feeling that something was amiss. Inside was worse than I had anticipated. The air was thick with humidity and an indescribable stench. The beam of the flashlight revealed stained walls and furniture shrouded in dust. I proceeded cautiously, attuned to every creak beneath my boots. Everything was silent, save for the incessant patter of rain against the roof. I explored the first floor without encountering anything unusual, but the smell was becoming more intense. The tension grew more intense near the kitchen. In a corner, I noticed something that halted me in my tracks, a door. It was small and concealed behind a partially shifted piece of furniture. It appeared to lead to the basement. The door was secured with a rusty padlock, but with a precise strike from my service tool, I managed to break it open. The hinges emitted a grating squeal that resonated in the silence as the door swung wide, revealing a staircase descending into pitch darkness. A stronger odor, a blend of decay and confinement, assaulted my senses immediately. I descended cautiously, each step creaking under my weight. Finally, my flashlight illuminated a cramped, claustrophobic area. The walls were covered in dampness and mold, and the floor was compacted earth. What I beheld in the center of the basement instantly stunned me. An old bed, little more than a mattress on a corroded metal frame, occupied the space. A young woman sat there, her gaze fixed upon me. Her face was pallid, her eyes sunken and encircled by dark shadows. She wore worn, threadbare clothing, and her hair was tangled. She appeared as fragile as a wisp of smoke. Beside her, two small children clung to her, observing me with wide, wary eyes. They were grimy, wearing clothes that clearly did not fit, as if they had outgrown their garments faster than they could replace them. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of rain. I found myself unable to speak or move for a few seconds that felt endless. The young woman attempted to rise, but her body seemed too feeble. The children remained close to her, as if they were her sole source of strength. Source of security. I scanned the surroundings, searching for more clues. In one corner, there was a table strewn with remnants of canned food, rusty utensils, and plastic bottles filled with water. A bucket served as an improvised toilet. The walls were covered with marks, lines etched into the surface, as if someone had been tallying days, weeks, or even years. My mind was in disarray. Who was she? How had she ended up here, and who was behind all this? The young woman gestured toward a shadowy corner. There, I noticed something else. An old wooden trunk secured with a padlock that appeared to be newly affixed. I didn't have much time to ponder it. I broke the padlock and opened the trunk. Inside, I discovered documents, old papers, photographs, and IDs. Among them was a picture of the young woman, seemingly taken years earlier, as she appeared healthier and happier. The name on the ID matched that of a teenager who had vanished nearly a decade ago. I vaguely recalled the case, one of those that turned cold and become buried among stacks of unsolved files. Yet, here she was, alive but broken by years of captivity. I continued to search for evidence. In another corner, I came across a makeshift desk. There were notebooks filled with handwritten notes. The writing was awkward and untidy, as if penned in haste or under duress. The entries spoke of interminable days of hunger and fear, but they also mentioned him, the man who had imprisoned her. The details were sparse, but sufficient to create a chilling image. She had been abducted as a teenager, forcibly removed from her life and brought to this isolated place. She had been kept here, severed from the outside world, compelled to endure horrors she could scarcely fathom. The children belonged to him, the result of years of torment and captivity. The sound of a car pulling up outside interrupted my thoughts. I quickly ascended the stairs, my gun at the ready. Through a shattered window, I glimpsed the headlights of a vehicle. It was an old sedan, the type that would go unnoticed on a bustling street. The driver emerged, a middle-aged man clad in a dark coat and a cap that obscured part of his face. He approached the house with unhurried steps, as if he had not a worry in the world. I recognized him immediately from the photographs I had discovered in the trunk. He was responsible. I waited for him to step over the threshold before confronting him. He offered no resistance. I handcuffed him as the rain continued to pour down on us, his expression blank, as if he failed to grasp the enormity of his actions. When backup arrived, the young woman and her children were rescued from the basement. The paramedics tended to them with care, but even in her weakened state, she clutched the children tightly against her chest, shielding them. Her eyes were distant, lost, as though she remained trapped in that basement, despite her physical freedom. That night, after completing my report, I sat in my car, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof. I couldn't shake thoughts of the marks on the basement walls and the notebooks filled with desperate words. I had done my duty, yes, but I couldn't help but wonder how many more like her were still out there. Lost some of its intensity, but the roads were still treacherous, slick with mud and scattered with fallen branches. As I made my way cautiously along the path to the Roberts home, A sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I approached their house slowly, the once lively home now shrouded in an eerie silence that sent shivers down my spine. Growing up on a farm in the northern countryside, I was accustomed to the vast expanses of wheat fields and dense forests stretching endlessly into the horizon. Our home stood isolated, like many others in that remote area, with the nearest neighbors residing several miles away. Despite our scattered community, there was an inherent unity born out of necessity. Life in the countryside has that unique quality. Regardless of the distance, you always feel part of something greater. The winter I turned 17 was marked by relentless rainstorms, more frequent than any I could recall. They transformed the dirt paths into rivers of mud, making travel arduous. It was during this seemingly endless torrent that our community's peace was shattered. 1 bleak morning, while assisting my father in the barn, the devastating news reached us. The Roberts family, our closest neighbors despite living over 3 miles away, had been discovered dead in their home. The exact circumstances were unknown, but rumors spread like wildfire through parched grass. I vividly remember the expression on my father's face when he heard the news. A man of few words, his eyes conveyed more than his lips ever could. Without uttering much to me, he saddled the horse and rode off to the Roberts farm, leaving our work unfinished. Though I remained behind, curiosity gnawed at me incessantly. When he returned hours later, his face was ashen and he refused to discuss it. I gleaned no further details until a couple of days passed, when I resolved to investigate myself. The rain had diminished somewhat, yet the roads remained perilous, slick with mud and littered with branches. The rain paused briefly, and I seized the chance to grab my bicycle and navigate the muddy path to the Roberts estate. The farm was enveloped in an unsettling silence, disrupted only by the distant cawing of crows. The Roberts residence, once a hub of activity, now resembled a lifeless shell, its windows darkened as if they had shut their eyes against the tragedy. A few carriages belonging to local authorities were stationed in front of the house. I concealed myself among the nearby trees, observing as men came and went, carrying boxes and jotting down notes in their notebooks. I didn't witness much more that day, but what I learned in the ensuing days sent chills down my spine. The entire family had been savagely murdered, the father, the mother, and their 3 children. There were no signs of a struggle or any clear indication of who was responsible. The doors had not been forced open, and nothing seemed to have been stolen. It was as though someone had taken their lives without any motive other than the act itself. The news rocked our community to its core. In the evenings, as the rain drummed incessantly on our roof, I couldn't shake the details that gradually emerged. They reported that the bodies had been discovered in their beds, as if caught off guard in their slumber. Some even speculated that they had known the perpetrator and had let him in willingly. Uncertainty cast a constant shadow over our community. For the first time in my life, my father began locking our house. No one ventured out after nightfall, and the roads, already desolate, became even more deserted. The sound of the rain, which I once found comforting, now seemed ominous and foreboding. The once comforting surroundings now made my nerves fray, leaving me on edge. One night, several weeks after the murders, I realized I could no longer remain passive. Curiosity, or perhaps a deeper compulsion, drove me to revisit the Roberts farm. Armed with a flashlight and my father's old shotgun, more for a sense of security than with any intention to use it, I set out. The road was enveloped in darkness and slick with rain that had begun to fall again. Upon arrival, the farm appeared even more abandoned than before. The house was shuttered, and the fields around it had turned into a muddy wasteland. I entered through the back door, which someone had failed to lock properly. Inside, the house mirrored the chaos left in the wake of the tragedy. Dust coated the furniture, and the walls seemed to absorb the pervasive sorrow of the place. As I walked down the main hallway, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The house felt suspended in time, as though the family might return at any moment. It was in the master bedroom that I discovered something unexpected. On a bedside table lay an open notebook. Though the pages were damp with moisture, the writing remained legible. It was a diary, presumably belonging to Mrs. Roberts. The most recent entries were unsettling. She wrote about sensing a strange presence near the house, as if someone were watching them. She menti. Once seeing lights flickering in the nearby woods at night and dogs barking without reason. On one page, her tone grew desperate. I know he's watching us. I have no idea what he wants, but I can't sleep. I'm terrified for the children. My heart was pounding. Holding the newspaper firmly in my hand, I exited the bedroom, resolute in my decision to report it to the authorities. However, just as I was about to leave, something on the hallway floor captured my attention. There were faint, dark spots, nearly invisible under the dim glow of my flashlight. I crouched to inspect them more closely. They were footprints. They didn't appear to be fresh, yet they weren't too old either. They were small, as if left by someone walking barefoot. I traced them to a doorway leading to the basement. The door was secured, but the lock seemed relatively simple to pick. Using a screwdriver I had found in the kitchen, I managed to unlock it. A rush of cold, damp air greeted me, accompanied by a metallic odor so strong it made me step back momentarily. I descended cautiously, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The basement was dimly lit and cluttered, with boxes piled up and rusty tools scattered about. Yet, in one corner, something drew my attention. There was a small recess, almost like a hole in the wall, concealed by an old blanket. As I approached, I noticed more footprints on the floor, this time more distinct. I pulled back the blanket, and my flashlight revealed a hidden nook. Inside, I discovered filthy clothes, remnants of food, and something that sent a chill down my spine. A knife, its blade still stained with dark traces. I recoiled instantly, my mind racing. Someone had been residing there, observing the family, preying on them from within their own home. It was the only plausible explanation. I hurriedly left the basement, clutching the knife wrapped securely in the blanket, and dashed back to my bicycle. The rain poured down in torrents, making it challenging to find my way home. The following day, I brought my discovery to the police station. Although the authorities delved deeper into the matter, they were never able to determine who was responsible. The case remained an enigma, an unsolved crime that continues to haunt our community even today, decades later. Whenever the rain pounds heavily against my window, I can't help but recall that house, the footprints in the basement, and the ominous presence that lurked so near to them, so close to us. The city lights flickered in the distance, a faint glimmer amidst a sea of shadows. It was a familiar landscape, yet every time I gazed toward that horizon, I felt the heavy weight of history, the burden of lives lost in this place. He had spent years as a war correspondent, bearing witness to the brutal conflicts that had ravaged this region. I had witnessed the darkest facets of humanity, but the night when I encountered terror in its raw form surpassed any previous ordeal. The evening began like any other. I roamed the city's streets, searching for stories to narrate. The distant echoes of gunfire served as a constant reminder that peace was merely an illusion. My colleagues and I had been reporting on a series of skirmishes on the city's outskirts. However, that night, an informant led me to an area recently ravaged by an assault. It was a neighborhood that had endured the war, yet was now being torn asunder. The rain had started to fall, clinging to the earth as if nature itself was attempting to cleanse it of its suffering. The streets lay abandoned, yet the air was filled with a tangible tension as I ventured further into the area. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the trickling water, creating an unsettling symphony. I halted before a building that had been ravaged by bombings. Its walls were charred and cracked, and the scent of smoke and death lingered heavily in the air. I retrieved my camera, driven by an urge to capture the reality that lay before me. Through the lens, I witnessed the chaos, debris, remnants of personal belongings, and the overwhelming silence that followed the destruction. It was a grim landscape, but I knew it was my duty to narrate the story that many preferred to overlook. As I navigated the rubble, a sound halted me in my tracks, a moan, faint and muffled. Curiosity and instinct compelled me to delve deeper. I ventured further into the building, feeling the dampness penetrate my very bones. The encroaching darkness seemed to envelop me, and a sense of foreboding settled in. Upon reaching a room, I discovered a man sprawled on the floor, injured. His face was smeared with blood and dust, and his eyes, filled with terror, locked onto mine. In that moment, I realized I was not alone in this nightmare. The war had left its indelible mark on him, and I was an intruder in his suffering. I crouched down to assist him, but a deafening roar shook the building, and the ground quivered beneath my feet. Instinctively, I recoiled, and in that split second, a cascade of debris rained down upon me. Agony pierced through me like a blade, and I collapsed to the ground, feeling the world around me fade into oblivion. Darkness enveloped me, and silence became a faint echo. When I regained consciousness, chaos surrounded me. The man had vanished, leaving only the echo of his despair in the air. I struggled to my feet, feeling a fiery pain coursing through my body, unsure of how long I had been unconscious. The rain continued to pour, and the sound of water mingled with screams from outside. Reality crashed over me with brutal force. I was in the midst of an attack, and the city was crumbling around me. My survival instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to escape. As I navigated through the debris, the air thickened, and the rain turned torrential, creating rivulets of mud on the ground. Shadows danced around me, and the sound of chaos trailed me like a ravenous predator. As I pressed on, the sight of devastation struck me like a blow. Bodies lay scattered, distant cries echoed, and the sense of death loomed around every corner. I managed to escape the building, but what I saw outside left me frozen. The street was teeming with people, many injured, others in shock, and some simply weeping for their loved ones who had vanished. Rain mingled with blood, forming puddles on the ground, and horror was visible at every turn. I began to move through the crowd, searching for a way to assist, but the desperation was overwhelming. Ambulances were arriving, but the chaos made rescue nearly impossible. I noticed a man struggling to drag his wounded son, and an impulse drove me to assist him. Together, we transported him to a more secure location, but as we progressed, the gunfire's intensity increased, and fear became our constant companion. Then, it occurred. A loud bang resonated through the air, and the ground trembled once more. The explosion was ear-splitting, and the world turned into a vortex of smoke and dust. I felt a sharp pain in my side and collapsed to the ground, the agony piercing through me like a lightning strike. The rain continued to pour, but it was no longer refreshing. It had turned cold and harsh, as if the sky itself wept over the unfolding events. My vision blurred, and the chaos slowly receded as darkness enveloped me. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a dimly lit room with flickering lights. I was in a hospital, but it was far from a place of healing. It was a nightmare. The atmosphere was saturated with screams and cries, the walls were marked with stains, and the floor was slick with blood. This was no ordinary hospital. It served as a refuge for the wounded in a war that seemed interminable. The rain continued to fall outside, its sound blending with the terror of those present. I attempted to move, but the pain held me back. As I surveyed my surroundings, I saw bodies on stretchers, some shrouded in stained sheets. Desperation shed itself onto the faces of the doctors and nurses who were valiantly trying to tend to everyone. It was a place of torment, a stark reminder that war waged not only on the battlefield but also within the confines of a hospital. My mind was flooded with images of those I'd seen fall and the despair I'd witnessed as death hovered. It was more than just a concept, it was a tangible presence enveloping me. I was aware of my good fortune in having survived, but the cost of that survival was the burden of the deaths I had witnessed. The hours turned into a cycle of agony and discomfort. The rain continued to pour, its sound mingling with the cries of the wounded. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the faces of those who hadn't been as lucky. The scenes of lifeless bodies on the streets and the torment in the eyes of the survivors played over and over in my mind. Eventually, a doctor approached me. His face was drenched in sweat and blood, and his eyes mirrored the exhaustion and horror of what I had endured that night. I was examined swiftly, and although I was acutely aware of the pain coursing through me, I understood that there were others in need of more immediate care. The war had robbed this place of its humanity, transforming what once was a hospital into a battlefield. As the hours slipped by, the rain persisted, and the cycle of suffering continued. The screams grew louder, and despair saturated the air. I felt powerless, trapped in a war that seemed endless. I realized I had made decisions that had brought me here, but I never imagined the horror would unfold in such a way. The night turned into a sea of shadows, and pain became my constant companion. The rain fell relentlessly, carrying with it a sense of sorrow and grief. In my mind, images of those I had lost intertwined with the desperation of those who still remained. Each was a poignant reminder of the ongoing nightmare. Story A life abruptly halted by conflict. When the storm finally abated, the tranquility that ensued was misleading. The hospital remained crowded with the injured, and the reverberations of war resounded in every corner. I was aware of my survival and realized how fortunate I had been, yet the price of that survival was a burden I would carry with me forever. The war had not only marked my body but also scarred my soul. The rain had claimed many lives, and its lament would continue to echo in my memory. The war had revealed its cruelest face, and although I had survived, I knew I would never be the same. The terror I experienced that night was engraved into my being, a constant reminder that peace is a luxury in a world where conflict is the norm. As I recuperated, I realized that my role as a war reporter was more crucial than ever. I had to narrate the stories of those who could not speak, those silenced by horror. The rain had witnessed terrible events but also the resilience of those who struggled to endure. It was my duty to give voice to their experiences, and despite the painful journey ahead, I knew it was a path I had to walk. The rain had subsided, yet the echo of the war still resonated in my heart. The story was far from over, it was merely beginning. The drops tapped against the window as I spoke these words, rhythmic and unyielding, as though attempting to erase an echo of the past that never ceases to reverberate in my mind. There are things that rain cannot wash away, scars that do not fade even with time. It's been 20 years since. Once my world crumbled, as everything I knew and cherished was torn away from me. Now, although I am free, my life still precariously balances between who I was and what injustice compelled me to become. That night started like any other, with the monotony of work defining my days. I recall leaving late, exhausted but eager to return home. The air was saturated with the scent of damp earth that always heralds a storm. The road home was slick, and the streetlights trembled in the downpour. Little did I realize that as I crossed the threshold of my door, my life would be irrevocably altered. Upon entering, an unsettling silence greeted me. It was unusual. There was always something in the house to pierce the quiet, the radio playing, the sound of running water, or Alina's footsteps. But that night, there was nothing. An eerie void filled the rooms, as if the house itself understood what had transpired. I climbed the stairs, a heavy sensation in my chest that I couldn't quite comprehend. Then I saw her. Elena lay at the foot of the stairs, motionless, her head twisted at an unnatural angle. There was blood, an overwhelming amount, spreading across the floor like a dark river that continued to expand. My legs buckled, and time seemed to freeze. I rushed to her, shouting her name, praying for any sign of life. Her skin was cold, and the texture of her blood-soaked hair remained imprinted on my hands. It was in that moment I realized, deep within, that I would never again hear her laughter, nor see her smile. With trembling hands, I called the police. When they arrived, they took everything, my testimony, photographs of the scene, and fragments of my life. At first, they claimed it resembled an accident. After all, who would have wanted to harm her? However, the autopsy unveiled what I couldn't comprehend. The injuries were inconsistent with a mere fall. The bruises on her neck and the fractures in her ribs narrated a different tale, one that involved violence and a struggle. Someone had been there that night. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall upon me. Who else could have accessed the house? Who else shared such an intimate bond with her? The questions were relentless. They interrogated me to the point of exhaustion, seeking inconsistencies in my account. Why were you delayed? Had there been any recent disputes? Was there tension in the marriage? My responses seemed to hold little weight. The office's suspicious glances made me feel guilty even before the trial commenced. And when the trial finally arrived, it was a spectacle. Friends I considered close took the stand and spoke about me as if they had never known me. They depicted an emotionally distant husband prone to anger, someone who harbored grudges. Every word was like a dagger. The prosecution portrayed me as a jealous and controlling man, unable to accept his wife's professional achievements. It didn't matter that none of it was true. The circumstantial evidence seemed to speak for itself. The judge delivered the verdict, 25 years in prison. My life came to a halt that day. Watching the cell doors close was akin to being buried alive. Within those walls, time stands still. Days and nights merged into a relentless cycle, leaving me alone with my thoughts, which invariably circled back to that fateful night. Who could have done it? Why? How had I failed to foresee it? Eventually, everything I cherished vanished. My parents passed away while I was incarcerated, taking with them the last remnants of warmth I had known. Friends ceased their visits one by one, unable to bear the heavy burden of the stigma. Even my memories of Elena began to dim, overtaken by visions of that final night. It wasn't until 2 decades later that the truth was unveiled. A retired detective, one of the few who always held faith in my innocence, had never ceased his quest for justice. He persisted in his investigation, meticulously combing through neglected evidence in the archives. One day, he discovered something everyone else had missed: a nearly invisible fingerprint on the staircase banister. It belonged to a man recently apprehended for a burglary under similar conditions. This man, a former maintenance worker, had been in our home weeks before Elena's death. According to new findings, he returned that night to steal, but Elena confronted him. In the ensuing struggle, he pushed her down the stairs, sealing his fate and, in doing so, shattering mine. My release brought more uncertainty than solace. I emerged from prison as a stranger in a world I no longer recognized. The house where we once lived was vacant, stripped of everything that had made it a home. Seeing it again was like reopening a wound that had never healed. The staircase remained, now dusty and forgotten, as if time itself had also moved on. I resolved to leave it all behind today as I attempt to reconstruct the remnants of myself. I reside in a modest apartment, a place devoid of history, where I can escape the shadows of my past. However, the pain remains persistent. On certain nights, when the rain taps against the window, I close my eyes and allow memories to surface. I envision what life might have been like if that fateful night had never occurred, if Elena were still here, if we had grown old together. But there is no turning back. The past is irrevocably written, and all I possess now is the present. Day by day, I strive to find meaning in it all. Perhaps I never will. Perhaps my existence will forever be a mere echo of what might have been. The rain continues to fall, relentless like time itself, erasing the traces of the present yet leaving the scars of the past etched into my soul. If I have gleaned anything in recent years as a content creator, it is that social media is a stage where perception is paramount. The illusion of success, exclusive collaborations, and opportunities that appear too fortuitous to be genuine are what captivate your followers, and sometimes they are also what can lead to your downfall. I had been in the industry for several years, cultivating a substantial following thanks to my videos of adventures in remote locales. The viewership always surged when I took greater risks: explorations in abandoned ruins, makeshift camps, and shadowy forests, challenges amidst storms. Yet, there was a threshold to all of this. One day, an offer arrived, seemingly ideal for elevating my content to the next level, though I couldn't have anticipated how much it would ultimately cost me. Earlier today, I received a private message on my Instagram account from a company specializing in survival gear. They claimed to have seen my content and expressed interest in collaborating with me. Their proposal involved filming a video at a unique location, a rustic cabin nestled in a secluded forest, ideal for capturing a sense of isolation. They offered to cover all expenses and provide a substantial payment for the completed video. I accepted without hesitation. How could I resist? It appeared to be a perfect opportunity: high-quality content, partnership with a renowned brand, and a handsome financial reward. The only condition was that I refrain from disclosing the location until after the video was published. They explained that this was to preserve the site's exclusivity. A week later, I found myself driving my van through light rain towards the destination they had specified. The instructions were precise. I was to follow a map they had sent via mail, as the location was not available on GPS. This wasn't surprising, as many of the remote places I had filmed it before were similar. The journey became increasingly challenging as I proceeded, the worsening rain transforming the dirt path into a mixture of mud and large puddles. I reached the forest's entrance just as dusk was setting in. The cabin was approximately a 2-kilometer hike from there. I parked my van, gathered my equipment, and ventured into the forest, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The cabin was smaller than I had anticipated, yet it possessed a rustic charm that promised excellent footage. It featured a few walls of weathered wood, a sloping roof covered in moss, and a single window that resembled a dark eye peering into the emptiness. However, something felt unsettling. Feeling uneasy, I was surrounded by an unsettling silence, disturbed only by the patter of raindrops and the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. Upon stepping inside, the ambiance failed to improve. The cabin was utterly barren, save for a solitary wooden table and a single chair. As expected, there was no electricity or internet connection, yet the sense of desolation was unmistakably present. A handwritten note lay on the table, welcoming me and reminding me to film a video promoting the equipment they had provided. My gaze fell on a box on the floor, adorned with the brand's logo. I opened it and found everything seemed to be in perfect order: flashlights, survival knives, and a sleeping bag. The first night was tranquil. I built a small fire outside to capture some night footage. The rain had eased, and the forest appeared even darker beneath the stars. However, when I returned inside, I noticed something peculiar. The chair was in a different position than I recalled. I thought it was merely my imagination or that I had inadvertently shifted it while arranging the recording gear. I slept fitfully, with the flashlight close by and the sleeping bag wrapped more snugly around me than usual. In the early hours of the morning, I was startled awake by a noise resembling the creaking of floorboards. I scanned the room but found nothing, assuming it was the wind or perhaps a small animal. Nonetheless, I struggled to fall back asleep. The following morning, I resumed recording more content. I captured shots of the forest, demonstrated how to use the equipment, and even improvised a brief narration about the advantages of being in such an isolated location, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss as I wandered through the area. During my exploration, I stumbled upon something that halted me in my tracks: an archaic video camera affixed to a tree trunk, aimed directly at the cabin. It was far from modern, resembling an old model, and was encrusted with rust and moss, suggesting it had been there for many years. As I drew nearer, I noticed a tape inside. Unable to resist, I decided to take it with me to inspect later. As I made my way back to the cabin, my unease morphed into outright fear. The door, which I had left firmly shut, was now slightly ajar. I entered cautiously, clutching one of the knives that had come in the box. The chair was once again moved, this time positioned in the center of the room, as if someone had been sitting there, awaiting my return. The remainder of the day slipped by in a haze of paranoia and uncertainty. I concluded that it would be wise to finish the video as swiftly as possible and depart at dawn. That night, while attempting to edit some of the footage, my flashlight began flickering. I replaced the batteries, but the problem persisted. As I rose to fetch another flashlight from the box, I heard a noise behind me, a dull thud against the wooden exterior wall. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight in every direction, but saw no one. Only the rain had returned with a vengeance, battering the leaves on the cabin's roof. I resolved to go back inside, this time securing the door firmly and using the table as a barricade. I spent the night wide awake, clutching the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. As dawn finally broke, every small sound had kept me on edge throughout the night. I quickly gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the area. However, the journey back turned into yet another descent into terror. About 100 yards from the hut, I stumbled upon something that froze me in place. A cell phone nailed to a tree trunk, eerily similar to the camera I'd encountered earlier. This phone was more modern, and when I powered it on, I discovered it contained videos. The footage depicted several people, both men and women, exploring the same cabin I had just left. Initially, the videos resembled simple adventure clips, much like the ones I had been filming. But the recordings ended suddenly with the same creaking noises I had heard during the night and the sound of doors being flung open. The final video sent a chill down my spine. It showed someone sleeping inside the cabin, and as the camera moved, I realized my own face was illuminated by the flashlight next to me. Terrified, I dropped the phone and sprinted away without looking back. I reached my truck, drenched and caked in mud, started the engine, and sped away from that place, vowing never to return. Days later, I attempted to reach out to the supposed brand that had employed me, but received no response. Their Instagram profile had vanished, and emails bounced back as non-existent. Since then, I've avoided remote locations, and whenever I receive an offer that seems too good to be true, my stomach knots with unease. Social media has given me much, but it has also taught me that behind every screen, something far darker than we can imagine may lurk. Just 2 days before, I had received that ominous offer. To an abandoned property on the city's outskirts. The payment was generous, perhaps too generous, considering my sole task was to prepare it for potential buyers. I had been informed that the house had stood vacant for years, as the owners were unwilling to tackle the accumulated dust and overgrown weeds in the garden. On the surface, it seemed straightforward. In hindsight, I should have been more cautious from the beginning. The address guided me down a meandering path flanked by bared trees, creating a natural tunnel. The overcast sky and constant drizzle cast a melancholy aura over the scene, as if time itself had chosen to pause there. As I approached, the house materialized at the road's end, solitary and weathered by the years. Its once pristine white exterior now bore damp stains and deep fissures. I switched off the car's engine and lingered for a moment, taking it all in. There was something peculiar about the property, an eerie silence that couldn't be solely attributed to the absence of life. The sound of rain drumming on the car's roof was the only thing disturbing the tranquility, yet even that seemed muted, as if the air was thicker in this place. Drawing a deep breath, I gathered my tools and stepped out to begin my task. The key was precisely where I'd been told it would be, tucked beneath a stone near the porch. The lock creaked as I turned it, and the door opened with a drawn-out groan, as if the house itself objected to my presence. Inside, the air was dense, saturated with moisture and a faint musty odor. The windows were so grimy they barely allowed any light to penetrate, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I moved forward. With every step, the hallway led to a spacious living room, where furniture draped in white sheets resembled motionless phantoms. Dust lay everywhere, accumulated in thick layers that testified to the place's neglect. I placed my belongings by the entrance and prepared to begin. As I swept, my thoughts drifted, attempting to ignore the mounting unease I felt within the house. There was something disquieting in the minor details. The fingerprints in the dust on the furniture, as if someone had been there recently, and the occasional untraceable sounds, like creaks from the upper floors. I kept reassuring myself that it was all in my head, that it was merely an old house responding to wind and humidity. The real issue emerged when I reached the kitchen. I opened the door, and a horrid stench assaulted me with such intensity that I stepped back, covering my nose. It smelled of rot, like decaying meat. I switched on my flashlight and scanned the area. There was nothing on the countertops or in the sink, but as I neared the refrigerator, the odor grew stronger. The fridge was sealed shut with tape. My initial impulse was to leave it that way. There was no need to open it. Yet, something within me, perhaps an unhealthy curiosity, compelled me to tear off the tape. The door opened with a sticky sound, and what I saw inside made me recoil instantly. Black bags, tied with knots, filled the space. I didn't UCH them, but the odor was enough to infer their contents. The rain continued to lash against the windows as I attempted to regain my composure. I reasoned that it might simply be some old rubbish that someone had forgotten to dispose of. However, the size and form of the bags made it clear they didn't hold ordinary waste. I firmly closed the refrigerator door and endeavored to resume my work, yet something had shifted. I felt as if the house itself was observing me, that the shadowy corridors and vacant rooms concealed something more. I continued cleaning at a brisk pace, striving not to dwell on it too much. Upon reaching the top floor, I discovered 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first room was bare, save for an old mattress and a broken chair. The second room, however, contained something that made me halt abruptly. It was a small space, its walls adorned with what appeared to be hand-drawn illustrations. As I drew nearer, I noticed they were sketches of people, faces devoid of identity, yet rendered with intricate detail. Strangely, some of these faces were aggressively crossed out, as though someone had desperately attempted to erase them. In the room's center was an open cardboard box brimming with photographs. As I leafed through them, a chill coursed through me. Each photograph depicted people seemingly oblivious to the fact they were being photographed, strolling down streets, sitting in cafes, entering buildings. Amidst these photos, one face stood out, mine. I dropped the photographs and staggered backward, my breath coming in heavy gasps. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but all signs pointed to someone having observed me, capturing these images without my awareness. Why were they here? Who had placed them there? A noise sounded behind me, and a soft yet distinct creaking sound interrupted my thoughts, reminiscent of someone treading on aged wood. I swung the flashlight towards the door, but no one was there. My heart raced as I cautiously proceeded down the hallway. I then heard another noise, this time emanating from downstairs. My instincts screamed at me to flee the house, to abandon my tools and escape, but something compelled me to stay. Perhaps it was the same curiosity that had driven me to open the refrigerator earlier. Carefully, I descended the stairs, gripping the flashlight firmly. The beam wavered with every step, barely illuminating a few feet ahead of me. Upon reaching the foyer, everything appeared to be in its place. I turned towards the kitchen and saw it. The back door was ajar, letting in the chill of the rain-laden air. I slowly approached, directing the flashlight outside, revealing only the backyard, overgrown with weeds and cloaked in shadows. I closed the door securely and made sure to bolt it. Although I feared I was being paranoid, an inner voice insisted that I wasn't alone. Returning to the living room, I gathered my tools, resolute in my decision to leave immediately. As I pivoted towards the entrance, I noticed something that froze me in my tracks. My boot prints on the dusty floor were no longer solitary. A smaller set of prints trailed from the back door to where I stood. Without hesitation, I bolted towards the front door, but when I attempted to open it, the lock refused to move. The door felt as immovable as if an unseen force were obstructing it from the opposite side. In a fit of desperation, I hammered on the wooden surface, but it was futile. The rain continued to pour, its sound now mingling with my quickened breath and racing heartbeat. Resolute, I chose to head back to the kitchen, intending to exit through the rear door. However, upon my arrival, I discovered it was locked once more. This time, a strip of refrigerator tape adorned the knob, as though someone wished to convey a message to me. I retreated, a chill of panic cascading down my spine. Then, I heard a sound that would haunt me forever. Footsteps on the upper floor, each step slow, and purposeful. I had no intention of discovering who or what was there. I dashed to the living room window, using a stool to smash the glass until it shattered. Leaping outside, the cold rain soaked me instantly. I didn't dare glance back as I sprinted to my car, urgently starting the engine and speeding away as fast as I could. Once I reached the safety of a gas station, bathed in the glow of fluorescent lights, I tried to steady my nerves. My thoughts kept drifting back to the images, the refrigerator, the footprints. Who had intruded into that house, and why did I still feel as though I was under surveillance? I never returned for my tools, nor did I contact the number that had hired me. All I understood was that something, both human and perilous, resided in that house, something I had no desire to encounter again. Yet, even now, on rainy nights, I can't shake the sensation of being watched from the shadows. I navigated cautiously through the slick streets, the windshield wipers working tirelessly to maintain my visibility. The exhaustion clung to my shoulders. It had been a long and arduous night. After an exhausting day at the office, my sole desire was to return home, cocoon myself in a blanket, and be gently lulled to sleep by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. However, while paused at a red light, something jolted me out of my daydream. Across the street, beneath the faint glow of a street lamp, I spotted a man. This wouldn't have been unusual, except for the chilling detail that the man was my exact double. His dark hair, the same sharp features, even his posture mirrored mine. It was like peering into a distorted mirror, for there was something subtly disturbing about the rigidity of his movements. He stood there, unmoving, as the rain drenched his clothes, his head slightly bowed, yet I could feel his eyes fixed on me. The traffic light turned green, and I accelerated, unable to endure the sight any longer. The rest of the journey was consumed by thoughts of what I had witnessed. Perhaps it was merely a case of pareidolia, an absurd coincidence that my weary mind had exaggerated. Yes, that had to be it. Yet, as I turned the key to unlock my apartment, an uneasy sensation lingered, as if an unseen shadow had trailed me home. I attempted to divert my thoughts by preparing dinner, but my appetite had vanished. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the rain, unable to shake the image of the man who was my spitting image. Eventually, I persuaded myself that there was no use fretting over something so insignificant and went to bed. The tranquility was short-lived. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I was startled awake by a crash, a loud thud that fell. Accompanied by the unnerving sound of something crawling, my heart began to race. With caution, I rose from my seat and meticulously examined every corner of my apartment. Despite my thorough search, everything appeared to be in order. Yet, as I glanced out the window, there it was once more. He stood on the sidewalk in front of my building, motionless in the rain, his gaze fixed intently on me. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a brief moment, I was paralyzed by fear. When I finally snapped out of it and blinked, he had vanished. The following day was a whirlwind of paranoia. At work, I constantly felt eyes on me. Every face in the hallway seemed to scrutinize me with a blend of curiosity and suspicion. In the afternoon, my boss summoned me to his office. His demeanor was somber, and my bewilderment grew as he slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of me, or rather, of someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to me. In the images, I was seen entering an industrial warehouse and exiting with a sizable package. The location was vaguely familiar, situated on the opposite side of town, a place I had never visited. My boss informed me that the police had reached out to the company, linking me to an ongoing investigation. The remainder of the day passed. In a haze, I felt ensnared in a bizarre dream where the lines between reality and illusion were blurred. The images were unmistakable. Someone identical to me was involved in illegal activities, and now I was entangled in the investigation. As I left work, the rain intensified, pouring down with greater force. I decided against heading straight home and instead made my way to the warehouse depicted in the photos. It was an ominous structure, surrounded by dilapidated, rusty trucks. The main gate was securely locked, yet a side door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of my fear, and I ventured inside, using my phone's flashlight to pierce the gloom. The air was thick with a musty scent, reminiscent of old oil, and my footsteps echoed off the metallic walls. I scanned the area, seeking any clue that could shed light on the photographs I had discovered. Signs of recent activity were evident. Open boxes, a desk cluttered with scattered papers, and in one corner, a monitor linked to a security camera. I switched on the monitor and reviewed the footage. There he was, my exact double, moving with precision and intent, carrying boxes and conversing with men who resembled seasoned criminals. The noise behind me caused me to spin around abruptly. No one was visible, but the sound of footsteps seemed to grow nearer. I quickly turned off the light on my phone and concealed myself behind a stack of boxes. Through a narrow gap, I watched as two men entered. Their voices were hushed, barely audible, yet their movements were efficient, as if they knew precisely what to search for. My heart pounded in my chest as I observed them rifling through the boxes, speaking to each other in tones that hinted at impatience. Seizing a fleeting distraction, I decided to make my escape. I quietly tiptoed toward the door through which I had entered, but just as I was on the brink of crossing it, a commanding voice called out to me from the shadows. I bolted, not daring to glance back, my feet splashing through puddles as I plunged into the rainy night. I heard shouts and the rush of footsteps behind me, but adrenaline propelled me faster than I ever imagined possible. When I reached my car, I started the engine and drove off, resolutely avoiding looking back. I was plagued with questions about the mysterious man who was masquerading as me. Why was he doing this, and more crucially, how could I establish my innocence when his face mirrored mine perfectly? Over the ensuing days, my paranoia intensified. I felt perpetually scrutinized, as if someone might suddenly appear to accuse me of crimes I hadn't committed. The news began reporting on a smuggling case in the city, and although they withheld names, every detail ominously seemed to implicate me. One evening, as I sifted through my mail, I discovered an envelope with no return address. Inside was a note inscribed in red ink that ominously stated, "We know who you are." I could no longer remain inactive. I needed to confront this, find my doppelganger, and unearth the truth before it became too late. I recalled a detail from the surveillance footage, a logo on one of the boxes my lookalike was carrying. It belonged to a nearby shipping company. The following day, under the relentless rain that continued to batter the city, I parked my car nearby and observed from a discreet distance. Hours passed before I finally saw him. He emerged from a white van, clad in attire strikingly similar to my own. Witnessing him in person was eerie. Every gesture, every movement was a mirror image of mine. I discreetly followed him on foot, staying concealed in the shadows. He paused in front of a building and entered. As I approached, I realized it was a rundown motel. I hesitated momentarily but ultimately decided to follow him. I found him in a room on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar and, from my position, I could see inside. I could see him seated, meticulously reviewing documents as my anger and fear amalgamated into a singular, volatile emotion. As I crossed the threshold, I confronted him, and he glanced up. Our eyes met for the first time, and it felt like staring into a dark mirror. A version of myself that should not exist. Although no words were exchanged, everything became crystal clear in that moment. I realized I had been chosen and manipulated. My life was merely a perfect facade for someone who needed to remain inconspicuous. The room was engulfed in a suffocating silence, punctuated by the relentless pounding of rain against the windows. I knew I had to act swiftly, but before I could determine my next move, the wail of sirens shattered the stillness. I bolted, leaving my doppelganger behind, aware that the authorities were closing in. Perhaps, just perhaps, I had eluded their snare. Yet, as I fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might not truly be over, and that man might persist in haunting me like a shadow I could never escape. The ceaseless patter of rain against the windshield was my sole companion on that desolate road. The raindrops cascaded down, distorting the car's lights and transforming the asphalt into an endless, black mirror. I had been driving for hours, attempting to leave behind the most draining week I'd experienced in years. Work was consuming me, and this journey was my means of escaping for a few days, just me and the open road. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. I had barely passed through a small town an hour ago, the last trace of civilization before reaching this stretch of road forgotten by the world. The GPS displayed an endless line winding toward the horizon. I didn't even have a signal to confirm if I was truly on the correct path. Everything seemed designed to keep me isolated, alone with my thoughts and the relentless drumming of the storm. It was then that I noticed something in the rearview mirror, lights appearing in the distance. Initially, I didn't pay them much heed. Encountering another car on this road was uncommon but not unheard of. However, the movement of the lights caught my attention. They didn't maintain a consistent distance. Instead, they seemed to approach rapidly, too rapidly, and then slow down abruptly, as if the driver were engaged in some sort of game. My intuition told me to disregard the lights, to maintain my speed, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The lights continued to draw nearer until they were almost glued to my bumper. Suddenly, they switched on the high beams, flooding my car with a blinding glare that made me squint. I slowed down, thinking perhaps the driver wanted to overtake me, but he didn't. Instead, he remained behind, alternating the high beams on and off repeatedly, as if to ensure I was aware of his presence. The discomfort gradually transformed into something else. A sense of danger crept down my spine. I tried to reassure myself, thinking maybe it was just some fool playing a prank or a frustrated driver. But then, the car behind me accelerated, pulling alongside me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw it. It was an old, battered sedan, its paint worn from years and exposure to the elements. The driver was merely a silhouette behind the rain. Through the fogged glass, I couldn't discern his face, but there was something about the way he kept his car aligned with mine, daringly navigating the road's curves in the inclement weather, that made me feel this encounter was far from accidental. I accelerated, unsure of my destination, yet certain I didn't want to linger and find out. My car's engine roared as I increased my speed, but the sedan matched my pace, mimicking my every maneuver. What once seemed an endless road now felt like a snare, a dead-end labyrinth where this stranger played the role of my relentless pursuer. I tried to make sense of the situation, searching for logic in something that lacked it. Perhaps I was being paranoid, or maybe it was just a coincidence. My thoughts were abruptly interrupted when the sedan LLED up behind me once more, drawing dangerously close, nearly brushing my bumper. The first impact was mild, a nudge that jolted my vehicle, but then came another, harder one. He was attempting to force me off the road. Fear gripped me as the slippery road made it difficult to maintain control of the car. Each time I tried to slow down, the sedan would strike me again. Every bend became a trial, every straight path an opportunity for that maniac to attempt something more sinister. I glanced around, desperately searching for an escape, a place where I could stop or call for help, but all I saw were dark trees in the rain, appearing like accomplices of my pursuer. At last, I spotted something in the distance, a turnoff. It was narrow and scarcely visible through the curtain of rain, but it was my only option. Without a second thought, I turned the steering wheel sharply. As I veered onto the turnoff, my tires skidded through the mud. The sedan hesitated for a moment but soon reappeared in my rearview mirror, its engine growling like a fierce creature. The path grew increasingly narrow and perilous, with tree branches scraping against the car and the mud causing the wheels to slip at every curve. The most terrifying part was that the sedan showed no signs of stopping. It was closer than ever. Each glance in the mirror made me feel as though the driver's shadow was engulfing me. I emerged into a clearing, an open area encircled by towering, ominous trees. I abruptly halted, not out of choice, but because the road simply vanished, leaving only a dense wall of vegetation and the tempest raging above. The sedan came to a stop behind me, its lights extinguished, and an overwhelming silence ensued, interrupted only by the raindrops drumming on my car's roof. Panic swiftly replaced fear. I locked the doors and searched frantically for something to use for protection, but the car was empty. My phone had no reception, and my mind was bombarded with images of news reports about people vanishing on desolate roads. Time seemed to freeze. For a brief moment, I hoped the driver would simply drive away, that it was all a misunderstanding. But then, I saw him emerge from the vehicle. The figure was tall, clad in a dark raincoat that obscured his face, moving slowly and purposefully, as if aware I had no escape. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I attempted to start the engine, but the car remained unresponsive, its battery depleted. For weeks, the engine had been failing, and it chose that very moment to completely die on me. In desperation, I pounded the steering wheel as the man drew nearer and nearer. Just then, something shifted. A light appeared in the distance, piercing the darkness like a beacon of hope. It was another vehicle, its headlights slicing through the rain as it neared the clearing. The man paused, turning toward the light like a predator caught mid-hunt. Without uttering a single word, he dashed back to the sedan, climbed in, and vanished into the night just before the other car arrived. I didn't stay to see who was coming. The instant the sedan disappeared, I exited my car and sprinted into the woods. I had no idea where I was headed, but anywhere was preferable to remaining there. I ran until my legs gave out, until the sound of the road was swallowed by the rustling rain through the trees. Eventually, I stumbled upon shelter, an abandoned cabin with shattered windows and a roof riddled with holes. I remained there until dawn, trembling with cold and fear. When the storm finally subsided, I found my way back to the main road and, ultimately, to safety. I never discovered who that man was or why he pursued me. Perhaps he was a madman, or maybe he had a sinister motive that I never truly grasped. But since that night, every time I drive along a deserted road, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, fervently hoping never to see those lights behind me again. I had witnessed a savage crime, a murder that had left an indelible mark on my memory, the image of that man with his cold demeanor forever etched in my mind. The relentless, unforgiving stare echoed in my mind like a mantra. Now was the moment for justice. The courthouse resided in an antiquated edifice, its stone walls seemingly absorbing the tension that permeated the air. As I approached, my footsteps reverberated through the deserted corridor, blending with the rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. Each step drew me nearer to the truth, yet also to peril. An inexplicable sensation of vulnerability enveloped me, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move upon entering the courtroom. The murmurs of the audience and the whispers of the attorneys enveloped me as I took my seat on the witness stand, feeling the weight of everyone's scrutiny. Opposite me stood the defendant, a man with a challenging expression, upright and unrepentant. He appeared to savor the attention he was garnering. I couldn't shake the thought of whether he was aware that I was the witness capable of sealing his fate in prison. The hearing commenced, and memories of that disastrous night surged back with intensity. I recalled the rain pouring down, the distant rumble of thunder as I strolled the streets, the atmosphere brimming with a tangible tension. When the scream pierced the air, my heart froze. Rounding the corner, I was met with a nightmare. A man collapsed on the ground, the assailant beside him, knife in hand. The scene was indelibly etched into my mind. Though I had dashed to alert the authorities, the image never ceased to haunt me. As the trial advanced, the defendant's lawyer sought to rattle me with probing questions. However, I held firm, fully aware that I possessed the crucial evidence. To be resilient, I had to remember the scenes I had witnessed every time I caught sight of that man. A shiver cascaded down my spine. He was the predator, and I was his prey. The tension in the room escalated, and I noticed several disdainful glances directed toward me. I couldn't allow that to affect me. That evening, after the initial day of the trial, I returned home with my heart lodged in my throat. The sensation of being watched lingered, haunting my thoughts. It wasn't mere paranoia. I was certain there was someone intent on silencing me. I felt as though the killer had painted a target on my back. The following morning, I resolved to visit the police station to convey my concerns. I wanted them to be aware of the danger I felt. However, upon arrival, I was informed that none of the investigators handling the case were present, meaning they couldn't assist me at that moment. This was the first indication that I needed to be more vigilant than ever. The days of the trial unfolded amidst testimonies and a whirlwind of emotions. Each time I stood to speak, I sensed the defendant's gaze piercing through me, a silent challenge that sent chills through my veins. The pressure was mounting, and I was overwhelmed with anguish. I knew my testimony was pivotal for a conviction, but I also understood the imminent risk involved. One night, after an especially tense day in court, I decided it was imperative to safeguard myself. I was in my apartment, listening to the relentless rain pounding against the windows when the doorbell rang. Peering through the peephole, I saw an unfamiliar man standing there. Anxiety seized me. I couldn't afford to take the risk of opening the door. On impulse, I decided to call the police once more, but my phone was useless. There was no signal. The storm had caused a power outage throughout the neighborhood, and the situation was growing increasingly terrifying. Before long, I heard noises in the hallway, firm, determined footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, leaving no doubt that someone was approaching. I stood silently, holding my breath as the sound drew nearer to my door. A loud knock reverberated through the wood, and my survival instinct surged. I knew I had to act swiftly that night. As the man attempted to open my door, I made a quick decision. I darted to the window, opened it as quietly as possible, and without glancing back, I leapt. The impact was painful, but there was no time to dwell on it. I sprinted down the street, desperately seeking refuge. With each step, I felt the threat pursuing me like a wolf hunting its prey. I managed to reach a nearby hotel, where the lobby was bustling with people. I called for assistance, and although fear was consuming me, I understood the importance of staying calm. The police were notified, and within minutes, they arrived to question me. I recounted everything that had transpired, from the man attempting to break into my home to my fears regarding the trial. It was a relief to realize I wasn't alone. The following days were a blend of tension and hope. The police implemented security measures, and my testimony grew even more vital. The trial continued, and despite the defendant's lawyer attempting to undermine me, I remained resolute. Yet, the threat did not dissipate. One night, while recuperating, upon reaching the hotel, I was confronted with shattering news. An informant had warned me that the assassin had issued an order for my elimination. A wave of terror swept over me once more. I was not merely a witness but now a target. Despite the fear that besieged me, I resolved not to surrender. I understood that I had to persist in seeking justice. The following day, as I approached the courthouse, I noticed detectives surrounding me. They had implemented measures to ensure my safety, and although the terror still gripped me, I felt I was not fighting this battle alone. The trial reached its peak, and the jury withdrew to deliberate. The silence within the courtroom was stifling, each second stretched into an eternity. A monotonous hum intensified my anxiety. Finally, the jury returned, and my heart thudded as I awaited the verdict. The courtroom was engulfed in a tense silence, and when the jury pronounced the word, "guilty," a profound sigh of relief coursed through me. However, the story was far from over. The defendant, consumed by rage, attempted to exact revenge even after his conviction, but the police had already taken preventive measures. Amidst the storm that swept through the city, the murder plot was thwarted. Despite efforts to silence me, I was secure. I spent time in the hospital, recovering from the toll of stress and fear. The killer, despite his attempts to dispose of me, was finally behind bars where he belonged. I came to realize that even though I had been at death's door, I had achieved what I set out to do: bring a dangerous criminal to justice. Life would continue, and even though the scars of the past would linger, I had prevailed. In my unwavering determination to confront the truth, I found the clarity I had been seeking amid the shadows of that trial. Despite the tumultuous journey, justice ultimately prevailed. It was a bleak and tempestuous night when I resolved to linger a bit longer at the office. Most of my coworkers had already departed, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. Only the faint hum of the computer and the patter of rain accompanied me in my solitude. The clock was nearing 10 o'clock when I decided I had reached my limit. I had been laboring over a report due first thing in the morning, but a lack of focus had trapped me in an endless loop of distraction. As I gathered my belongings, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a brief moment, the outside world became visible through the window. It was then that I heard a sound, a noise that didn't belong to the storm. It was a scream, a high-pitched cry that pierced the air and reverberated in my ears, sending chills down my spine. I froze momentarily, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The sound emanated from the first floor, where the main entrance to the office was located. Without considering the potential consequences, I felt compelled to investigate. Curiosity and a desire to help took over, and I cautiously descended the stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. The rain continued its relentless drumming, yet the sound of the water seemed distant now. As I reached the lower floor, the atmosphere felt different, charged with a palpable tension. The light by the door was. As the light flickered, shadows danced across the window. Despite this movement, the office remained eerily silent, devoid of any signs of life. Everything was unnervingly quiet. I cautiously peered out, attempting to discern the situation. That's when I noticed him, a man with an imposing stature clad in dark attire, standing at the entrance as though he were anticipating someone. Beside him was a woman, her eyes wide with fear, appearing desperate for a savior. The terror etched on her face compelled me to act, but the rational part of my mind warned against intervening. The man seemed to be arguing with her, gesturing aggressively. My heart raced as I tried to comprehend the scene unfolding before me. The woman attempted to retreat, but he grasped her arm tightly, her scream piercing the darkness. In that moment, I recognized the urgency to intervene. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and though fear threatened to immobilize me, the need to assist her overpowered my hesitation. I searched for a place to conceal myself, somewhere I could observe without being detected. I slipped behind a stack of boxes in the corner, holding my breath. From this vantage point, I could see everything clearly. The man began to shove the woman outside, and horror enveloped me as I realized I was witnessing an abduction. The wind howled outside, and at that instant, the man turned toward the street, seemingly awaiting an accomplice. The woman, still fighting to break free, screamed with all her might, but her cries were drowned out by the cacophony of the night. The situation overwhelmed me, leaving me engulfed in a sense of utter helplessness. I longed to scream and rush to her side, but logic dictated that I could not. The man posed a significant danger, and any misstep could endanger his life. As the scene played out before me, I noticed the man clutching something. A glimmer caught my eye, and the image gradually crystallized in my mind. It was a knife. The realization that he wielded a weapon filled me with dread. The woman, sensing the imminent threat, fought with renewed vigor, but the man, with overpowering strength, dragged her toward the door. In a frantic bid, I reached for my phone, needing to alert the authorities. However, my hands trembled and panic clouded my reasoning. All I could do was watch, hoping that someone else had heard the cries and was coming to help. Yet, as the minutes ticked away, the situation grew increasingly dire. The man forced the woman outside, and before I could fully comprehend the unfolding events, I saw the rain drenching her clothes, the night's darkness enveloping them in a shroud of terror. In a final, desperate bid for freedom, the woman shoved the man, causing him to stumble backward. In that moment, I knew I had to act. Overcoming my paralysis, I stepped out from my hiding spot, driven by the urgency to intervene. I began sprinting toward the door, internally screaming at myself to reach it before it was too late. But the man recovered swiftly and, in a sudden twist, lunged at me. I hit the ground, winded by the impact, the chill of the scenario settling over me. The earth beneath me merged with the adrenaline surging through my veins as the man advanced with a menacing demeanor. I caught the glint of the knife in his hand, while the woman, still attempting to break free, screamed in desperation. Her cries, however, were swallowed by the roar of the storm. In that instant, my survival instincts kicked in, and I swiftly stood up, trying to create distance between us. Enraged, the man lunged at me, but I managed to evade him just in time. I felt the air shift around me as his arm swept past. The chaos of the situation enveloped me, yet I knew surrender was not an option. Seizing the opportunity, the woman dashed towards the street, but the man was relentless. In one swift motion, he seized her again. The terror in her eyes pierced me like a dagger, and her sobs mingled with the howling wind. At that moment, I realized something drastic needed to be done. Summoning a surge of courage, I resolved to confront the man. I couldn't allow this criminal to escape unchallenged. I charged towards him, feeling the weight of my actions. The man turned, startled by my reaction, and in an instant, his expression shifted from surprise to rage. He brandished the knife, and fear washed over me once more, but I refused to yield. We wrestled for a brief moment, the sound of our bodies clashing resonating in the air, each movement a desperate bid for survival. The woman, still striving to liberate herself, watched in horror. Finally, in a stroke of fortune, I managed to disarm him. The knife clattered to the ground, and in his fury, the man shoved me forcefully. I tumbled once more, but this time, panic had transformed into fierce determination. The woman, seeing the weapon was no longer a threat, joined the fray. Together, we managed to drive the man back until he finally stumbled and collapsed to the ground. Seizing the chance, we dashed for the exit, adrenaline surging through my veins. As we reached the street, the storm's cold air struck me, and though the rain drenched our clothes, I felt we had successfully escaped the grip of terror. But our sense of freedom was short-lived. In the darkness, I saw the man rise again, his eyes blazing with rage. Before he could reach us, however, the sound of approaching police sirens cut through the chaos, bringing a wave of relief that began to fill the air. Realizing he couldn't escape, the man turned and fled in the opposite direction. Yet, the rain had rendered the streets slippery, and he quickly lost his footing, falling to the ground once more. The scene was soon illuminated by police lights, and within minutes, several officers arrived. The woman and I stood there, drenched and trembling from a mix of fear and adrenaline. The police swiftly approached us, ensuring our safety as we recounted our ordeal. The storm continued to rage, mirroring the world's ongoing turmoil. The man was arrested on the spot, and as he was led away in handcuffs, his eyes met mine. A glimmer of fury and desperation shone in his gaze, but I knew he would not evade justice. The police took our statements, and though fear still clung to me, it felt like we had won a significant battle. Sitting in the back of a patrol car, I watched as the world continued to spin. In spite of the tempest, I came to the realization that the abduction was merely the beginning of a much larger struggle. The woman, still quivering, gazed at me with gratitude, and in that instant, I understood that we had forged a connection amidst the terror. After what felt like an endless stretch of time, we returned to the office. The crime scene had been cleaned up, and although the ordeal had left its mark on me, I was certain I had acted rightly. I had confronted my fears and fought for another person's life. As the storm subsided and the sky began to clear, I sensed that life would continue. I learned that courage isn't always measured by grandiose deeds but by the readiness to confront the unknown. Life at the office would never be the same again, yet there was a newfound sense of purpose within me. I realized that even though horror had descended on a dark night, the light of justice could shine through, even in the toughest of situations. The storm had passed, and now I could look forward with the hope that, despite everything, there is always an opportunity to do what is right. It was a gloomy and tempestuous day when I received the call. The phone's ring shattered the silence in the police station, where the atmosphere felt weighted, as if the storm outside was on the verge of breaking. The woman on the other end had a voice that was trembling, laden with anxiety. She worked at a welfare office and had received an unusual complaint. She spoke about a woman who had come to cash her social security check, appearing nervous and scared. The woman had discreetly handed her a note, stating that she was in grave danger, that her THR. The note warned that 3 children were in peril and urgently required assistance. It included an address that piqued my curiosity, accompanied by an instinctive urge to act swiftly. Although I wasn't sure what to expect, the anxiety in the woman's voice suggested there was more at stake. After assembling a team of officers, we proceeded toward the location specified in the note. A heavy downpour enveloped us, casting a somber mood that seemed to foreshadow impending events. The journey was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts as we neared the destination. An uneasy feeling intensified within me as we entered an impoverished neighborhood, marked by dilapidated homes and an air of neglect. Upon arrival, the scene was bleak. The house, an aged wooden structure, exuded a dismal aura with its windows draped in tattered curtains. No lights were visible, only an oppressive silence filled the space. It felt as though we were stepping into a realm ruled by darkness. We approached the door and, after knocking, received no response. I exchanged glances with my fellow officers, and without uttering a word, we knew it was time to proceed. We forced the lock and pushed the door open, revealing an even more unsettling interior. The stench of mold and decay hit us immediately. Our flashlights revealed a cluttered living room, with dust-covered furniture and broken toys scattered across the floor. I called out to the woman who had sent the note, but there was no trace of her. As we ventured further, the silence seemed to thicken, as if the house itself was concealing secrets. As if the building itself were holding its breath, my colleagues and I started to investigate the rooms. Each step I took reverberated ominously in the shadows, and the tension mounted with every corner we turned. We reached a room that was locked. Although the door was secured, when I leaned against it, the wood groaned as if in protest. I managed to push the door open, and what lay within was nothing short of chilling. The room was stripped of any furniture, adorned only with a few faded photographs hanging on the walls. In the center stood an old, unkempt bed. However, what truly captivated my attention was the scene unfolding before me. In one corner, a woman lay curled up, her face gaunt and dirty, reflecting a profound fear. Her eyes, wide and full of terror, met mine with a blend of hope and skepticism. It was clear she had been in that room for an extended period. As I drew nearer, I observed that her clothing was tattered and patched, and her skin was ghostly pale, as if she hadn't been exposed to sunlight for years. As we attempted to communicate with her, a piercing scream erupted from downstairs, a sound so horrifying it sent a chill through my veins. Without hesitation, I sprinted toward the source of the scream, my companions close on my heels. As we descended the stairs, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the echo of the scream continued to ring in my ears. Yet, the silence that ensued was even more unsettling. Upon reaching the basement, the darkness felt almost tangible. I switched on my flashlight, and its beam revealed a cramped, damp space. The walls were coated with mold, and the air was thick with a repugnant stench. In the corner, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat. Something made me halt abruptly. There were 4 children, malnourished and terrified, huddled together, their eyes reflecting a fear I could never have fathomed. I crouched down to speak to them, but their fear rendered them mute. Then, I noticed the woman who had sent the note, situated in the opposite corner of the basement. She was in chains, and her eyes were wide with horror at the sight of us. As I moved closer, I realized that whatever had transpired in that house surpassed any crime I had encountered in my career. The man who had inhabited the house, the one who had kept that woman captive, suddenly materialized at the basement entrance. His presence was formidable, his cold, defiant stare sent a shiver through me. There was something in his demeanor that unmistakably signaled he would not allow us to take anyone away. The tension in the air was tangible. At that moment, I understood I was confronting a monster. I endeavored to stay composed as I slowly retreated from the children, but inside, panic was escalating. The man began to speak, and though his words were barely a whisper, the malice in his voice was unmistakable. He talked of possession, of control, of how he had sheltered the woman and the children from a harsh world. It was clear that he had warped reality to the extent that he believed his own madness. As I tried to gauge the situation, my colleagues began to encircle the man. I knew we had to act swiftly, but the threat was immediate. The man turned to me, his eyes blazing with rage, as if he understood that his time was dwindling and that Ma made him even more perilous. In a sudden motion, the man lunged at one of my companions, and a fight erupted instantly. Chaos consumed the basement, with blows and screams reverberating off the walls. Terror seized the children as the woman in chains watched with eyes full of fear, realizing she had to act. While the officers attempted to restrain the man, I rushed to the woman in the corner. The chain binding her was hefty, but with some effort, I succeeded in freeing her. Her grateful expression was a beacon of hope amid the darkness. Yet, there was no time to waste. With the woman by my side, we moved toward the children. The altercation continued in the background, and the noise was overwhelming. My colleagues were doing their utmost to contain the man, but the situation remained volatile. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I guided the children out of their corner, one by one, and led them toward the exit. It was a desperate maneuver, but I knew fear could not be allowed to hold them back. The sound of water droplets hitting the ground mingled with the tumult of the fight. We successfully led the children and the woman out of the basement, and the light from outside illuminated their pale faces. Despite their fear, a flicker of hope glimmered in their eyes. Police sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling that help was on the way. When we finally emerged, my companions had subdued the man and managed to bring him under control. The rain fell mercilessly, as if the sky itself was weeping. Washing away the terror that had unfolded in that house, the woman and her children were relocated to a secure environment where they could receive the much-needed care they desperately required. The woman had lost her husband 5 years prior, and following his passing, she found herself without a home. The man who had come to her aid had actually been her captor, exploiting her vulnerability to mistreat her and maintain control over her. Her youngest son, born from that coerced relationship, had also endured that nightmare. The sorrow and horror of the situation loomed over me like a dark shadow, and I realized that from that moment on, nothing would remain the same. The faces of the woman and her children were indelibly imprinted in my memory, serving as a reminder that although there is light in the darkness, sometimes the darkness can be overpowering. As the days passed, the case gained attention, and the story of the woman and her children resonated within the community. The pursuit of justice became a collective outcry. Despite the sadness, there was a glimmer of hope in the air. The rain that had fallen that night had brought with it the truth and the promise of a fresh start. I had been working as a delivery driver for a couple of years, and although the job was repetitive, there was something about the routine that I found soothing. However, there was one customer who began to disrupt that sense of peace. The building where I lived was an old apartment complex, worn down by the passage of time. Every time I went there, a chill would run down my spine. The door to his apartment was marked with the number 7, and there was something unsettling about it. There was always an enigmatic aura surrounding it, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. From the very first time I delivered a package to that address, his peculiar behavior caught my attention. The resident, a man in his middle years, had a disheveled appearance, with unkempt hair and a beard that seemed to have been neglected for weeks. Often, I would catch him gazing out the window as if he were anticipating something, or someone. His eyes, dark and profound, held a haunting intensity and always regarded me with a blend of curiosity and suspicion whenever I handed over his order. What unsettled me the most were the instances when he didn't respond immediately to the doorbell. On numerous occasions, I found myself waiting several minutes on his doorstep, feeling the man's stare as if it were boring through the wood. In those moments, the silence was palpable, and the rain continued its relentless fall outside, as though the world had come to a standstill. During those brief pauses, I pondered what might be keeping him. Why did it take so long for him to answer? One evening, as a storm battered against my truck's windows, I decided it was time to make his delivery. As I approached the building, a wave of anxiety washed over me. The lighting was dim, and the atmosphere felt stifling. I ascended the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. When I reached the door of apartment 7, I noticed the light was off. I pressed the doorbell, and the chime reverberated through the stillness. I waited, as was customary, but this time, the wait seemed interminable. The wind howled outside, amplifying the sense of solitude. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a noise as the deadbolt shifted with a soft click, and the door gradually opened. There he was, staring at me with that familiar intensity. There was no greeting, just a silence that enveloped us both. I handed him the package, which he accepted without meeting my gaze. His hand trembled slightly, and for a moment, I sensed his anxiety hanging in the air. As I started to close the door, an unsettling feeling washed over me. I couldn't just leave like this. Something urged me to linger and investigate further. I asked him if he required anything else, though I didn't anticipate an answer. He simply shook his head, closing the door with a gentle thud. The sound reverberated down the hallway, and I stood there, feeling the chill against my skin. The following night, I returned to continue my usual route. As I reached the building, I sensed a change. The door to apartment 7 was slightly ajar, allowing a narrow beam of light to seep through, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the surrounding darkness. Driven by curiosity, I approached and peeked inside. The apartment was in chaos. Papers were strewn across the floor, and the flickering light of a lamp sent shadows dancing on the walls. But what captivated me most was the sound, a low, steady murmur emanating from within. It was as though someone was speaking, yet the words were indistinguishable. My heart began to race. The urge to step inside was overpowering, but I knew it wasn't my place. Nevertheless, something within me. I resisted the urge to turn around as the rain continued to pour, the sound growing louder as if beckoning me. Ultimately, I decided to venture further inside. As I stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air felt dense, saturated with a blend of moisture and something indescribable. I glanced around and noticed more disarray than I had anticipated. On a table lay crumpled papers, some torn, alongside a framed photograph of a group of people. I recognized the man in the picture, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman and 3 children, all smiling, yet their expressions appeared distant, as if their joy was locked away in a remote memory. The murmuring persisted, urging me onward. I ventured further into the apartment, feeling that each step drew me closer to an unseen chasm. The kitchen was shrouded in darkness, and as I opened the door, the murmur transformed into a muted wail. In the shadows, I saw the man seated in a chair, his face buried in his hands. He shivered, and though I didn't know why, I felt compelled to approach. The wailing grew louder, and at that moment, he lifted his head. His eyes were brimming with tears and despair. I couldn't grasp what was happening, but I sensed a profound secret was anchoring him in that state of vulnerability. Suddenly, he sprang to his feet, the chair tumbling to the floor, the sound reverberating throughout the apartment. His gaze turned intense, and I realized I had overstepped a boundary I shouldn't have. With a swift motion, I spun around and dashed for the exit, panic beginning to take hold. As I descended the stairs, a profound sense of alarm took hold of me, persisting as the sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the reverberating storm. Once outside, I inhaled deeply, feeling the cool, moist air fill my lungs. I glanced back, but the door to apartment 7 was already shut, as if the night's events had never transpired. As I drove away, my thoughts continually returned to that apartment. The murmur, the desolation reflected in her expression, the image of the family gathered around the table. Something was amiss, and this unease gradually turned into an obsession. In the days that followed, my routine became monotonous, yet whenever I was near the building, I felt an irresistible urge to return. It was as though an unseen force was drawing me back. A week later, I went back to make another delivery. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was palpably tense. I hesitated for a few moments before pressing the doorbell. The door swung open, but this time the man appeared altered. His gaze was more intense, almost defiant, though he showed no sign of vulnerability. I sensed a shift in his demeanor. I handed him the order, which he accepted silently. As the door closed, a thought struck me. I needed to uncover the truth. Acting on impulse, I leaned forward and pushed the door. This time, it yielded, allowing me to enter uninvited. The apartment was even more cluttered than before. The flickering light cast an erratic glow, and the now louder murmur echoed in my ears. I followed the sound, which led me back to the kitchen. There, a scene unfolded that froze my blood. On the table lay an array of photos and documents scattered about. As I drew closer, I realized that the scattered items were newspaper clippings. The faces of the women and children in the photographs seemed oddly familiar. They were individuals reported missing in the local media. My heart froze. The man who had been watching me was connected to something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. In that moment, I was certain I wasn't alone. A young boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face smeared with dirt and etched with fear. His wide eyes conveyed a haunting mixture of terror and desperation. The murmuring I had heard transformed into a silent scream, and his presence made me acutely aware that I had stumbled upon a chilling secret. The man shifted behind me, his breathing heavy and labored. In an instant, I comprehended that I had crossed a perilous boundary. A rush of adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I knew I had to escape immediately. Without contemplating the repercussions, I pivoted and sprinted toward the door. As I exited, I felt his hand graze my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't pause. I dashed down the stairs, propelled by fear toward the exit. Once outside, I inhaled deeply, attempting to steady my racing heart. Though the storm continued to rage, its sound was drowned out by the chaos in my mind as I struggled to make sense of what I had witnessed. I was certain I had to take action, but I hesitated, uncertain whether to delve deeper into this unfolding narrative. That night, as I drove home, the boy's face repeatedly surfaced in my thoughts. An unshakable restlessness gnawed at me, and the image of the man, his despair and the enigma shrouding his existence, haunted my mind. I realized he was merely a delivery man, and technically, it wasn't my business to interfere. However, an instinctive urge to safeguard those children drove me to take action. I resolved that the following day, I would do something about it. I couldn't allow fear to paralyze me. The storm had unveiled something I couldn't overlook. The next morning, I headed to the police station and recounted everything that had transpired. My superiors listened intently, though their expressions were tinged with skepticism. Yet, a part of me remained resolute. A team was assembled to investigate, and although I understood there was little more I could do, I felt a sense of relief for having chosen to speak up. A few days later, I returned to the building. The rain had ceased, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Upon my arrival, I noticed that the door to apartment 7 was shut, but there was a distinct atmosphere in the air. Police cars were parked outside, and officers were conversing with one another. The investigation was in full swing. Observing from a distance, I experienced a blend of relief and apprehension. The storm had brought the truth to light, and although the journey to justice would be prolonged, I knew I had done the right thing. I couldn't erase the image of the boy's eyes from my mind, nor the whisper I had heard. It was simply that the darkest secrets can emerge, and one's bravery can make all the difference. Perspiration began to trickle down my forehead as I listened to his words. They spoke of networks, of connections, of a business that was expanding. It was a merciless criminal world, and each individual involved was prepared to do whatever it took. Their intent to safeguard their interests. However, when one of the men uttered a particular name, I felt the breath leave my lungs. It was a name that resonated deeply within me, belonging to an acquaintance from the neighborhood who had vanished several months earlier. Everything suddenly made sense. His disappearance, the criminal network, the pervasive fear that had engulfed the community. It was a relentless cycle that seemed impossible to break. As I continued to listen, a sense of anguish took hold of me. I was in peril, and not merely from the threat of being discovered. I understood that if I didn't act promptly, more individuals would inevitably suffer. I resolved that I had to escape and relay this vital information to the authorities. But as I attempted to retreat, a crunching noise beneath my feet betrayed my presence. The men turned toward me, and in an instant, chaos erupted. I sprinted toward the exit, my heart hammering as their shouts escalated into frantic cries. The cold night air struck my face as I dashed through the streets. I was uncertain if I was being pursued, but fear drove me onward, each footfall echoing in my mind like a drum marking the cadence of my escape. The neighborhood I had once vowed to protect had transformed into a maze of shadows and threats. I finally reached my home, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. The sound of the running water faded into a distant whisper. I knew I needed to act. Swiftly, the information I had gathered was critical, and I couldn't allow it to disappear into obscurity. Later that night, I sat at my computer and began composing a comprehensive report. I meticulously documented every encounter and every conversation I had observed with. With each word I wrote, I felt the tension ease slightly. Once I finished, I sent the report to the local police, hoping they would take action before it was too late. Days went by, and it seemed as though the heavens shared my anxiety. I was unsure if my report had made any difference, but a sense of hope began to grow within me as the police finally started to take notice. They commenced patrols around the neighborhood, determined to track down the criminals I had mentioned. One night, during their rounds, I noticed lights flickering in the old warehouse. My heart skipped a beat. The police had arrived. From a safe distance, I watched as the officers surrounded the building, the air thick with tension. I felt a blend of relief and apprehension, knowing the danger hadn't yet fully subsided. The operation was executed swiftly, and the men I had observed in the warehouse were apprehended. News of the arrest spread rapidly throughout the neighborhood, yet I had a hunch that this was merely the beginning. The battle against crime wouldn't conclude with the dismantling of a single network. Although the situation had improved, fear still lingered in the shadows. I realized I couldn't abandon my role as the neighborhood watchman. There was much more to accomplish, more stories to uncover, and more people to safeguard. Over time, the community began to unite, neighbors getting to know one another better. Together, we formed a unified front against crime. I discovered my purpose, and even though the night could be dauntingly dark, I knew there was light in the unity of those who refused to surrender. With each storm we faced, the neighborhood grew stronger. I had learned that despite the ever-present fear, he had always believed there was a fighting chance, recognizing that his role as a night watchman extended beyond mere patrol duties. It was his responsibility to be the voice for those who had been silenced. Though the battle was far from concluded, he was prepared to confront it, drop by drop. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when it all began, but the first time he became aware of it was on a Thursday evening. After enduring a taxing day, he returned home drenched from a sudden downpour that caught him unprepared, lacking an umbrella. As he emptied the contents of his coat pockets, a small piece of paper, folded into quarters, tumbled to the ground. Initially, he assumed it was a forgotten receipt or one of those promotional cards that often find their way into your grasp unnoticed. However, unfolding it left him frozen in place. It was a handwritten note in blue ink, its contents resembling something straight out of a crime novel. Friday 8:30 p.m. Riverton Street, number 37. 45-year-old male. Knife murder. Witness. Young woman, aged 20 to 25. Flees before police. He read the note multiple times, attempting to decipher its meaning. The paper was crumpled, as if it had languished in his pocket for some time, yet he had no recollection of ever seeing it before. The words were inscribed in a tightly packed, slightly slanted script, neat enough to be legible, yet so ordinary that it offered no hint of its author. His initial assumption was that someone had inadvertently slipped the note into his pocket, perhaps during a commute, on the street, or even while he waited in the coffee shop that morning. However, the more he scrutinized the words, the stronger his sense grew that it was not an accident. All of it seemed too precise to be mere chance. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was none of my concern, likely just a prank or a misunderstanding. Yet, something gnawed at me, and that night, I hardly slept. I was plagued by the thought that if the Ote was genuine, something dreadful might unfold the following day. On Friday, the rain continued to pour relentlessly. Instead of heading straight to work, I decided to take a detour and drive by the address mentioned in the note, 37 Riverton Street. It was a neighborhood I knew in passing, lined with modest, poorly maintained houses, the sort of place where secrets could easily be concealed behind locked doors. I arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. I parked cautiously at a distance, my heart pounding like a drum. From the car, I observed the house. It appeared unoccupied, with the lights off and no signs of life in the windows. I could hear the sound of my breathing mingling with the rain pattering on the roof of the vehicle. Time seemed to crawl, the hands of the clock moving in slow motion, while doubts gnawed at my mind. Why was I there? What if it was all just a coincidence? But then, a car pulled up in front of the house. A tall, burly man emerged, wearing a dark coat and carrying a briefcase. He ascended the porch steps and entered without a second thought. The scene seemed ordinary, even mundane, yet something within me whispered that I was witnessing the start of something ominous. My breathing became more labored as I waited, the minutes dragging on like hours. Finally, another figure appeared. A young woman trudged through the rain, clutching a broken umbrella that barely shielded her from the downpour. She paused in front of the house, glanced around, and, after a brief moment of uncertainty, ascended the same set of stairs. My mind raced with intensity. Everything aligned, the note, the address, the man, and now this young woman. Was this a warning or some cruel twist of destiny? I was at a loss. If I contacted the police, what could I possibly tell them? That I had received an enigmatic note detailing a crime that had yet to occur? I had no evidence, only a crumpled piece of paper and my escalating paranoia. Minutes dragged by, and nothing seemed to transpire within the house. My thoughts began to unravel, and I questioned whether I had misconstrued the situation entirely. But just as I was on the verge of convincing myself to leave, the lights in the house flickered and went out. My body tensed, and the ensuing silence was overwhelming. Then I saw her. The woman dashed out of the house, umbrella forgotten, her face ashen and contorted with fear. She stumbled on the stairs, nearly falling, before vanishing into the inky darkness of the street. Panic seized me. Something terrible had transpired. Without a second thought, I leapt from the car and sprinted toward the house. The door stood ajar, and as I pushed it open, a metallic scent assaulted my senses, blood. My stomach churned, but I pressed onward. The scene that greeted me in the living room was one I would never be able to erase from my memory. The man lay there, lifeless, in a pool of blood. Expanding beneath his body, the knife remained embedded in his abdomen, a makeshift yet deadly weapon. I glanced around, searching for any sign, any clue that could shed light on what had transpired, but the house stood empty, the sole sound being the relentless rain drumming on the windows. Panic morphed into sheer terror when I realized I couldn't linger there. If anyone found me at the scene, there would be no plausible explanation for my presence. I fled the house as swiftly as my legs would permit, my heart lodged in my throat as I sprinted back to the car. I drove aimlessly, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I struggled to comprehend what had just unfolded. The note had served as a warning, but from whom? And why was I the target? Questions spun in my mind like a whirlwind, yet I found no answers. For days, I scoured the news, hoping to see any mention of the murder, but nothing emerged, no reports, no investigation. It was as though the crime had never occurred. I felt ensnared in an endless nightmare, unable to discern reality from paranoia. Then, a week later, I discovered another note in my pocket. This time it was even more detailed. Saturday, 10 p.m., Alder Street, number 12. A 32-year-old female, strangulation, no witnesses. The panic returned with a vengeance. I knew I couldn't dismiss this new warning, but I was also at a loss for what to do. Should I go again or inform the police? Every option seemed to propel me further into a spiral of chaos and dread. I don't know what awaits me this time, but one thing is undeniable. I am no longer in control of my life. Something, or someone, has rendered me an unwitting pawn. In myself witnessing horrors I am powerless to prevent, ensnared in a game from which I am clueless about escaping. The rain was relentless on the day I collected the keys to the apartment. The landlord, an elderly man with a face devoid of any expression, seemed more focused on finalizing the transaction than on providing details about the property. It didn't concern me much, after all. I had been searching for an affordable place, and this one was within my budget. It was small, yes, but offered a cozy enough prospect for a fresh start. The building exuded a sense of decay. The paint on the walls was faded, and the elevator operated with a disconcerting rattle. My apartment was situated on the 4th floor. I ascended the stairs carrying the lighter boxes, leaving the heavier ones in the car for later. Each step reverberated in the empty corridor, amplifying a sense of isolation that I couldn't quite understand. Upon opening the door, the interior of the apartment greeted me with a stale odor and something else, a faint metallic scent that I couldn't quite place. The living room was modest, with walls tinged in a yellowish white that revealed years of neglect. An old armchair, abandoned by someone, occupied a corner, and a small kitchen lay at the back. The windows were misted by the rain, filtering a gray light that made everything appear even gloomier. That first night, as I unpacked my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place was off. Perhaps it was the silence. Despite the building housing several tenants, I heard no voices or footsteps, just the constant drumming of raindrops against the glass. The following day, while cleaning, I discovered so. In the dim corner of the bedroom closet, an unusual sight caught my eye. A dark stain on the floor, nearly black. Though it appeared dry, it felt tacky to the touch. I attempted to clean it with a damp cloth, but it stubbornly refused to disappear entirely. I dismissed it as one of those irremovable marks you often find in old places. Later that afternoon, a neighbor knocked on my door. She was an elderly woman with a gentle yet weary face. She introduced herself as living downstairs and kindly offered her assistance should I ever need it. I was grateful for her generosity, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that her expression betrayed something left unsaid. Hesitating before she departed, she lingered at my doorway for a few moments, her silence creating an unsettling atmosphere. That night, I struggled to sleep, waking repeatedly with the unsettling sensation that someone else was in the apartment. I inspected each room, switched on the lights, and even peered under the bed, finding everything in order. Nonetheless, my imagination ran wild. Every sound, the The creaks, the rustling, the wind rattling the windows, seemed magnified in the stillness of the place. On the third day, as I was sorting through some papers, I stumbled upon an envelope concealed within the compartment of an antique piece of furniture left by the prior tenant. It was filled with newspaper articles, all pertaining to a murder that had taken place in this very building less than a year ago. The main headline read, "Young man found dead in fourth-floor apartment, killer still at large." My heart pounded as I absorbed the words. The address listed was unmistakably my apartment, and the article recounted the grim discovery. Why of a young man in his 30s who had been found dead, bearing multiple stab wounds. The police had conducted an investigation, but the case remained unresolved. There were no witnesses, and the few neighbors who had spoken offered no valuable insights. Suddenly, I recalled the stain in the closet, and a wave of nausea washed over me as I pieced together what it likely signified. The apartment seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in on me, but the most unsettling sensation was the feeling that I was being watched. That night, while attempting to calm myself, I heard a sound in the hallway, a soft footstep, as if someone was walking barefoot. I approached the door and peered through the peephole, but the hallway was deserted. Nonetheless, the sound lingered, gradually fading in the direction of the stairs. My imagination ran wild, conjuring stories about who or what might be lurking there. In the days that followed, I began to observe more peculiar occurrences. Items I would leave in one spot mysteriously appeared elsewhere, and doors I was certain I had locked were found ajar. I tried to convince myself it was merely my mind playing tricks on me, but there was something more, something concrete. The sensation of being watched was relentless, especially during the night. One evening, as I returned from shopping, I spotted the landlord engaged in conversation with someone at the entrance of the building. The individual was a tall man, clad in a hood that obscured most of his face. His posture was rigid, and although I couldn't catch what they were discussing, the exchange seemed tense and charged with an unspoken intensity. As soon as the landlord spotted me, he swiftly bid farewell to the other man and hurried inside the building, deliberately avoiding any interaction with me. The stranger, however, lingered, his gaze fixed on me, sending a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace, unnerved by the encounter. That night, my anxiety reached its zenith. As I lay in bed trying to sleep, faint noises emanated from the bedroom closet, a gentle, almost undetectable rustling. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Mustering every ounce of courage, I seized a lamp from the nightstand to use as an improvised weapon and cautiously approached the closet. When I opened the door, it revealed nothing unusual, yet something caught my eye that sent a wave of terror through me. The stain on the floor was not dry but fresh, glistening ominously in the light of the lamp, casting a reddish hue that hadn't been there earlier. I recoiled, stumbling backward onto the bed. Just then, a knock echoed from the apartment's front door, insistent and forceful, as though someone was determined to gain entry. I stood motionless, waiting, but the knock didn't come again. Summoning the nerve, I peered through the peephole, only to find emptiness. The hallway door remained shut, and the relentless rain continued to batter against the windows. I spent the night sleepless, perched on the couch with the lamp clutched in one hand and my phone in the other, wrestling with the decision of whether to call the police. But what could I report? A suspicious stain and unsettling noises? There was no tangible proof, only my escalating paranoia. The following day, resolved to get answers, I marched to the landlord's office on the second floor and demanded an explanation. He initially tried to evade my questions about the events that transpired in the apartment. However, he eventually confessed that the previous occupant had passed away there, adding that he was not legally required to reveal this information unless specifically asked. His tone was icy, almost dismissive, as though my unease was of no concern to him. That afternoon, as I was packing my belongings to vacate the apartment, I stumbled upon something else on the window frame. There was a tiny engraving, nearly imperceptible to the naked eye, bearing the name Andres. Through newspaper clippings, I uncovered that this was the name of the previous resident, the victim of the tragic incident. That night, while I was loading my things into the car, I caught sight of the hooded man once more. He was standing motionless across the street, drenched in the rain. This time, he wasn't looking directly at me, yet his mere presence was enough to send chills down my spine. I got into the car and drove away from the scene, resisting the urge to glance back. I have no idea who that man was or why he was there, but something deep down tells me he was linked to what occurred in that apartment. I may never uncover the truth, and frankly, I prefer to remain in the dark. Now, I reside elsewhere, far from that building and the shadows that envelop it. Yet, sometimes when it rains, I can't help but peer out the window, hoping I won't encounter that figure once more. The hum of traffic faded as the doors of the building closed behind me. It was a rainy night, with that kind of humidity that seeps into your bones. I had finished late at the office, another exhausting day. After an exhausting day, all I yearned for was to return home, take a steaming shower, and erase the events of the day from my mind. However, life sometimes has different plans, and that night, I would discover them in the most unfortunate manner. The building was nearly deserted, with the lobby lights flickering intermittently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I approached the elevator with a sense of reluctance and pressed the button. It was an old elevator, the kind that creaks ominously as it moves, perpetually giving the impression of an impending mishap. Yet, after such a long day, climbing the stairs to the 10th floor was not an option I was willing to entertain. The doors opened with a metallic groan, and inside stood a man. He was tall, clad in a black jacket that seemed to have absorbed the rain like a sponge. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his eyes were visible, dark and penetrating. They gazed at me in a manner I couldn't decipher, as though he was assessing me. I stepped into the elevator, striving to conceal my unease. It was one of those vintage models, just spacious enough for two individuals, making proximity unavoidable. I pressed the button for the 10th floor and observed that he hadn't selected any floor. He was merely standing there, hands tucked into his pockets, watching the doors close. The elevator began its ascent with its customary sluggishness, accompanied by mechanical sounds that made me wonder how much longer it would function before requiring replacement. I tried to disregard it, concentrating on the panel of lit buttons, but my attention drifted back to the man when I noticed his eyes were still fixed on me. As my gaze fixed on the reflection in the metallic elevator doors, my mind began to drift, recalling tales I'd heard about robberies and assaults in confined spaces. I attempted to calm myself. After all, I was weary, and perhaps my imagination was deceiving me. Suddenly, the elevator came to an abrupt halt between the 4th and 5th floors. The jolt was so sudden that I nearly lost my footing. The lights flickered momentarily before going out entirely, enveloping us in darkness. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the sound of our breathing. I retrieved my phone to use its flashlight feature, but there was no signal. The only illumination came from the dim emergency light on the ceiling. The man remained unmoving, which unnerved me more than if he had acted. The darkness made everything seem more ominous, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being observed. I decided to speak to ease the tension, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about his stance, the way he breathed so steadily, that made me feel exposed. I pulled out my phone once more, this time to locate the emergency button on the panel. I found it and pressed it, hoping to hear an operator's voice, but there was nothing, only the echo of my own breathing. Suddenly, the man moved slowly, taking something out of his pocket. My heart pounded as I considered the worst possibilities. A gun, a knife, anything that could transform that confined cabin into a death trap. The emergency light cast eerie shadows on his face, distorting his expression. The flicker of the lighter made the scene even more unsettling, and despite my efforts to conceal my fear, it was nearly impossible. The object he revealed was a lighter, and as he ignited it, a small flame illuminated his entire face. His eyes remained fixed on me, and there was something abnormal in his expression. It wasn't anger or fury, but neither was it calm. It was as though he was deliberating, weighing a decision. I realized I couldn't just stand idly by, so I approached the control panel, attempting to manually open the doors, but they wouldn't move. The man continued to watch me, advancing slowly in my direction, and in the cramped space of that booth, every movement felt magnified. The warmth from the lighter made the air feel denser, more oppressive. With each step he took, my sense of danger escalated. Suddenly, he extinguished the flame with a swift motion, plunging the cabin back into darkness. My breathing became erratic, and I instinctively recoiled, hitting one of the elevator walls. My mind raced, desperately searching for an escape plan, something I could use for defense in that confined area, but there was little I could do. The elevator groaned once more, as if attempting to move, but it remained still. Then, I heard it, a faint metallic noise. The man was handling something in his other pocket, and the tension was unbearable. The thought that he might have a weapon immobilized me, but I knew remaining stationary would not improve the situation. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I spoke, striving to sound composed, though my voice betrayed me with its tremor. I told him that everything would be fine, I assured myself, certain that they would fix the elevator soon. He didn't reply. Instead, he just gazed at me as if my words were meaningless. Suddenly, the elevator jolted once more, and the lights flickered before stabilizing. The car remained stationary, but at least we were no longer enveloped in darkness. The restored lighting allowed me to observe the man more clearly. There was something peculiar about him, something that didn't quite make sense. His clothes were damp, but not merely from the rain. On the sleeves of his jacket were dark stains that resembled blood. A knot formed in my stomach as my mind swiftly assembled the pieces. The silence, his demeanor, the stains. I realized I was trapped with someone who likely wasn't there by mere coincidence. I tried to maintain my composure, but each passing second tested my nerves. The man stepped closer, and that's when I noticed what he was holding in his hand, a small screwdriver. It wasn't a typical weapon, yet in the cramped confines of the elevator, any object could become deadly. My survival instincts kicked in. I needed to act before he did. I moved toward the button panel, feigning an attempt to press the emergency button again. At first, he didn't seem to react, but when he noticed my other hand reaching for something in my pocket, a key I carried with me, his stance shifted. He scrutinized me more intensely, as if evaluating whether I posed a threat. The silence was abruptly shattered by a metallic noise emanating from the ceiling of the elevator, the unmistakable sound of someone tampering with the cables. My heart skipped a beat as I contemplated whether they were fixing the elevator or if someone else was present. The thought that he might not be alone crossed my mind, transforming my fear into overwhelming paranoia. Then, as if destiny decided to step in, the elevator doors partially opened, creating a gap of about 20 centimeters. It was just enough to glimpse the dark shaft between the floors, but not sufficient to escape. The man turned towards the opening, then glanced back at me with a look that left me frozen in place. Without any warning, he lunged at me, screwdriver raised. I narrowly evaded his attack, striking his arm with the wrench I held. Although the blow didn't stop him, it bought me enough time for my instincts to kick in. I summoned all my strength to shove him against the elevator wall, trying to disarm him. The struggle was brief but intense, and the confined space made every movement feel desperate. Finally, I managed to wrest the screwdriver from him and hurled him to the opposite side of the car. He looked at me, panting heavily, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, without warning, he darted toward the door opening. With agile precision, he slid down the elevator shaft, vanishing into the shadows. I stood there, gasping, not fully comprehending what had just occurred. Minutes later, the elevator resumed its ascent, carrying me to the next floor. When the doors opened, I stumbled out, seeking assistance. I found a security guard, but when we returned to the elevator, it was empty. There was no trace of the man or the screwdriver, the only evidence of what had transpired. My life? My initial unease was quickly overshadowed by the camaraderie we all shared. Yet, I couldn't shake the uneasiness entirely. It lingered like a shadow, always in the periphery of my mind. The moment I heard the keys turning in the lock of my apartment door, I was jolted back to reality. It was just another evening with my friends, one of those spontaneous gatherings that ended with laughter, empty beer bottles, and conversations swinging between the ridiculous and the profound. We were a tight-knit group of 6, bonded not only by time but also by secrets, confidences, and loyalties that seemed rock solid, or so I believed at the time. Everything began to shift a few months back when David came into our lives. We were introduced to him through Raul, who had a remarkable talent for drawing new people into our circle. David was affable, with an effortless smile and a charisma that quickly endeared him to us. I can't pinpoint exactly when he transitioned from being Raul's acquaintance to becoming an integral part of our group, but at some juncture, he no longer felt like an outsider. The initial indications that something was amiss were subtle, almost invisible. In hindsight, they should have raised red flags from the start. Once, during one of our meetups, David casually mentioned details about my personal life that I was certain I hadn't shared with him. I assumed Raoul might have told him, though it wasn't typical of Raoul to discuss others. I brushed off the concern, thinking why would someone like David have any interest in delving into my affairs? Nonetheless, the feeling of discomfort never completely faded, lurking in the back of my mind. As time marched on, increasingly bizarre occurrences began to unfold in my life. On one occasion, I received an anonymous email containing a screenshot of a private message I had sent to Clara, a friend within our group. Although the message wasn't compromising, the mere notion that someone was prying into my communications was unsettling. I pondered telling the others but hesitated, feeling paranoid. What could I say? That someone was eavesdropping on me, that I suspected a guy who appeared to be entirely harmless. The breaking point arrived on a rainy night. We had planned to gather at Lewis's house to watch a game, yet David was notably absent. He claimed to be occupied with a personal matter, which was unusual for him since he rarely declined an invitation. The evening proceeded as normal, filled with laughter and banter, but when I returned home, something caught my eye. My front door was slightly ajar, causing my heart to leap. I checked my pocket to ensure my keys were there. They were. I entered cautiously, attempting to remain silent, and found everything in its usual place, except for one detail. My desk was open, and the papers I had neatly organized were scattered as if someone had rifled through them in haste. The connection was immediate. It couldn't be mere coincidence. Something within me insisted that David was involved, even though I lacked any evidence. In the days that followed, I began to scrutinize him more intently. I confided in no one, not even Raoul, who had always been my trusted confidant. I needed to discern the true nature of this man who seemed, piece by piece, to be infiltrating every aspect of my life. The first step in unraveling the truth about David was to learn more about him. He professed to be a programmer, yet the more I inquired about his work, the more elusive his responses became. One evening, while the group gathered at our usual bar, I asked him to demonstrate some of his projects. He simply shrugged it off, insisting it wasn't anything noteworthy. His evasiveness triggered all my internal alarms. That's when I made the error of confronting him, albeit indirectly, during what seemed like a casual chat. I subtly suggested that someone among us might be hiding something, intending to watch his reaction. To my surprise, he remained composed, even joking that his only dark secret was his terrible taste in music. Yet, there was something unsettling in his gaze, as though he was fully aware of his actions. That night, I resolved to dig deeper. After everyone parted ways, I discreetly followed David to his apartment. I observed him entering, and from my vantage point on the sidewalk, I watched as he switched on the living room light. I lingered for a few minutes, gathering the courage, and then approached. My plan was straightforward: to quickly scan the place and find evidence to support my suspicions. What I discovered was far more terrifying than anticipated. The living room window was slightly ajar, allowing me to see a wall adorned with photos. I recognized every face in them. It was us. Every member of our group, including myself, was captured in those images. These weren't ordinary snapshots. They depicted private moments, some taken without our knowledge. One image showed Raoul entering his office, another, her of Clara on her balcony. There was even one of me asleep on my couch. My blood ran cold. I returned to my apartment that night with trembling hands. I had sought the truth, but now that I had uncovered it, I was at a loss for what to do. Confiding in anyone meant confessing that I had been watching him. What if no one believed me? David was charismatic and charming, capable of easily twisting the situation to his advantage. The following days were tortuous. Every time we gathered in a group, I felt his eyes locked on me, as if he were aware of what I had discovered. But the worst came when I found a note on my desk. It was a brief message written in impeccable handwriting. "Stop meddling where you're not wanted." I realized then that not only was he aware I had followed him, but he was also issuing a warning. But a warning about what? What was his true intention? I resolved to delve deeper into the matter, but before I could, an event occurred that changed everything. Clara disappeared. At first, it wasn't apparent. She simply ceased responding to our messages, and we assumed she was preoccupied or that her phone was malfunctioning. However, on the third day, her family filed a missing persons report. That was when the police discovered her car abandoned on the outskirts of town, with her belongings still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, but the disappearance was undeniable. The group was shattered, especially Raoul, who was particularly distraught. To my astonishment, David appeared genuinely concerned. He took the initiative to organize a search among friends and acquaintances, and for a fleeting moment, I questioned my suspicions. Could someone so deeply involved be responsible? I could hardly. Why believe someone I once considered trustworthy could be behind something so sinister? My skepticism vanished, however, when I discovered yet another note in my apartment. This one was more explicit. I warned you. Clara didn't listen to me, and look where she is now. My stomach churned with anxiety. I was uncertain whether I was being manipulated or if David truly bore responsibility for what transpired with Clara. It was clear I had to take decisive action. I gathered all the evidence I had collected, the photographs from his apartment, the notes on my desk, the anonymous messages, and brought them to the police. Unfortunately, lacking concrete proof, they were limited in their ability to act. They advised me to keep my distance from him and to reach out to them if anything further occurred. That evening, I returned to my apartment feeling a sense of defeat. Despite my efforts to thwart him, David always seemed to be one step ahead. Yet, as I entered my home, something caught my attention. My window was ajar, allowing a cold breeze to sweep through the room. On the floor lay something I hadn't anticipated discovering, a photograph. It was of Clara, bound and with a look of sheer terror. On the back, a message was scrawled, causing my heart to skip a beat. Your turn is next. Suddenly, I understood he was not merely an infiltrator but a predator, and I had unwittingly walked into his trap. As rain began to batter against the window, I realized the only way to survive was to confront him before he could complete what he had initiated. Driving long distances had never fazed me, in fact, I relished it. There was something about the expansive road and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt that brought me peace. That was why I didn't hesitate. To offer a couple of complimentary seats in my car when I planned the journey north wasn't solely about splitting fuel expenses, even though that was a bonus. I relished the prospect of meeting new individuals, listening to diverse stories, and occupying the time with more than just the music on the radio. Posting the advertisement on the rideshare app was a breeze, and soon enough, I had 2 respondents. The first was Valeria, a young student who needed to reach a city en route to visit her family. The second was Gabriel, who seemed like a reserved individual, speaking only a few words to me while confirming the pickup location. It didn't bother me, as it wasn't the first time I had transported quiet passengers, and I wasn't anticipating anything unusual. On the morning of the trip, the rain was pouring heavily. I picked up Valeria first at her dorm. She was carrying a light backpack and greeted me with a timid smile. Gabriel was next. He waited at a corner, holding a black suitcase and wearing a raincoat that obscured much of his face. He barely glanced up as he entered the car, but I noticed something in his eyes. They seemed cold. I assumed it was just a fleeting impression and dismissed it. The first few kilometers were silent. Valeria and I chatted briefly about her studies while Gabriel remained quiet, gazing out the window. His presence was somewhat unsettling, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was his rigid posture or his reluctance to join the conversation. Midway through, I even attempted to engage him with some casual remarks. By dense, towering trees, their branches casting eerie shadows under the dim light. The earlier banter that had once filled the car now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Gabriel's earlier preference for monosyllabic responses had gradually extinguished the lively conversation between Valeria and me, leaving only the patter of rain and the hum of the engine to accompany us. The first indication that something was amiss occurred at a gas station, where we paused to refuel and stretch our legs. Gabriel's decision to remain in the car struck me as peculiar, yet I refrained from questioning it. Valeria and I ventured inside the store to purchase some snacks. It was during this brief interlude that I noticed the gas station attendant, an elderly man, casting a disapproving glance towards our vehicle. "Is everything okay?" I inquired, attempting to break the uneasy silence. The man slowly shook his head but remained silent, his eyes unwaveringly fixed on the car, more precisely, on Gabriel, who sat in the back seat as still as a statue. There was something unnerving about the way the attendant watched him, a blend of fear and suspicion that sent a chill down my spine. Upon returning to the car, I observed Gabriel with his hands thrust deeply into his jacket pockets, gripping them tightly. I feigned ignorance, but an unsettling intuition gnawed at me, suggesting that something was amiss. The following hour on the road was fraught with tension. Valeria seemed to have sensed the odd atmosphere as well, as she ceased her chatter and frequently glanced at her phone. Gabriel, on the other hand, remained utterly still, his gaze fixed intently on the road ahead, as if he were meticulously planning something. He neither spoke nor moved, yet his presence filled the car with a disquieting energy. Then, it happened. We approached a forlorn stretch of road, bordered by dense, looming trees, their branches casting ominous shadows in the dim light. The earlier conversation that had once filled the car now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. As we drove through open fields, with no sign of life for miles, Gabriel, who had uttered no more than 3 words up to that point, unexpectedly spoke. "You could take the detour," he suggested, indicating a narrow dirt road that was scarcely discernible in the rain. His tone was calm, almost amiable, yet something inside me hesitated. There seemed to be no justification for a detour, and the main road was undoubtedly safer. I mentioned my preference to stick to the original route, to which he offered no reply. He merely nodded. However, I noticed his hands clenching even tighter inside his pockets. The atmosphere inside the car became oppressive as the rain intensified, and the road appeared to stretch on endlessly. Valeria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and I felt sweat accumulating on my palms despite the cold. Gabriel, in stark contrast, seemed utterly at ease, almost as if he relished the silence. It wasn't until we halted at a small roadside eatery that everything spiraled out of control. Valeria and I stepped inside, leaving Gabriel behind in the car. As I stood in line to order coffee, I glanced out the window toward the vehicle. Gabriel was nowhere to be seen, his door ajar, and his suitcase missing from the back seat. A knot formed in my stomach. I quickly rushed out into the rain to search for him, but there was no trace of his presence. His figure had vanished into the shadowy expanse of the road and the nearby forest. I considered calling him, but my phone had no signal, and something within me warned against it. Upon returning to the car, I realized I had left something in the back seat. It was a large, razor-sharp knife with a worn handle, indicating it had been used numerous times. I glanced up at Valeria, who had returned to the car and was now staring at me with a pale complexion. There was no need for words. We both understood that we had picked up someone who shouldn't have been there. I placed the knife into the glove compartment and started the car, attempting to remain composed, but the fear lingered, growing with each mile we traveled. It wasn't long before we saw him again, standing by the roadside in the rain, the black suitcase at his feet. He didn't raise his hand to signal us to stop, yet his eyes were fixed on us as we drove past. It was as if he knew we wouldn't stop, and yet he seemed content. I didn't sleep that night. After dropping Valeria off at her destination, I drove without interruption until I reached home, haunted by the feeling that those eyes were still watching me. The following day, I read in the news about a man found dead near the gas station where we had stopped. There were no leads on the killer, but the description of a suspect matched Gabriel perfectly. Since then, I haven't offered ride-sharing again, but every time I'm on the road and see someone by the roadside, I can't help but recall that look and the knife he left behind. I don't know if it was a warning, a threat, or simply his way of telling me he had outsmarted us, but I know I'll never feel secure on the road again. Traveling for work had never been my favorite task, yet this time I had no choice. My boss had sent me. I was sent to a far-off city to finalize a crucial business deal, and the pressure of not making a mistake was immense. After hours of driving through relentless rain, I finally reached the hotel. It was a humble establishment with an aging exterior and a flickering neon sign that seemed to be on the verge of giving out. I didn't mind. All I needed was a bed and a few hours of rest before the meeting the following day. Upon entering, the atmosphere inside was just as dreary as the outside. The air had a musty scent mingled with old wood, and the yellowish lighting cast a gloomier shade over everything than it probably deserved. Nonetheless, the receptionist was amiable and efficient, assigning me to room 205 on the second floor. He handed me a metal key attached to a heavy, worn key ring that felt uncomfortably cold in my hand. I trudged up the stairs with my suitcase, feeling each step creak under my weight. As I reached the hallway, a shiver ran down my spine. It was narrow and dimly lit, with faded wallpaper that seemed to be peeling away in some spots. The doors had numbers on rusted metal plates, and mine was nearly at the end, facing room 206. The room itself was simple but adequate. A double bed, a small desk, an old TV, and a tiny bathroom. The first thing I did was kick off my shoes and collapse onto the bed. The sound of rain pelting against the window was the only noise I could hear. I closed my eyes, hoping that a couple of hours of sleep would be enough to rejuvenate me. Just as I was about to drift off, the first noise emerged. Initially, I dismissed it, assuming it was just another guest getting settled. However, the noises persisted, resonating with heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, accompanied by what seemed like the scraping of furniture. I opened my eyes and stared at the wall that divided the two rooms, trying to discern what was happening. The sound was so distinct that I could easily envision someone moving a chair or a table. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Hotel walls are often thin, and it wasn't the first time a noisy neighbor had disrupted my rest. However, as the banging intensified, a sense of unease crept in. There was something odd about the sounds, too chaotic, too insistent. Then, I heard something else. A thud, louder than the previous noises, followed by what might have been a muffled groan. I got out of bed to listen more closely. The noise abruptly ceased, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the air. I considered calling the front desk but opted to check the hallway first to see if I could find an explanation. I opened the door and glanced in both directions. The corridor was deserted, and the door to room 206 remained shut. The flickering ceiling light only heightened the sense of eeriness. I returned to my room, convinced I was overreacting. Minutes later, the sounds resumed, more intense this time, almost violent. Repetitive banging against the wall and a clattering noise that resembled something metallic hitting the floor made my heart race. Ignoring it was no longer an option. Something was definitely happening in room 206. Finally, I called the front desk and explained the situation to the receptionist. It was unfolding, and I asked him to investigate the room. His response left me frozen in place. Room 206 was vacant. I insisted there had to be an error, but he reassured me that no one had rented that room. I even heard him verifying the system while we spoke. His composed tone only heightened my anxiety. What was I listening for, then? I hung up the phone and attempted to calm myself. Perhaps I had misunderstood. Maybe the noise originated from another room and not room 206. Resolving to check for myself, I ventured into the hallway once more, this time with renewed determination. I proceeded slowly towards the door of the adjacent room, scrutinizing it intently for any sign of movement or a shadow beneath the door. Nothing. The silence in the corridor was complete, save for the distant echo of the rain. Pressing my ear against the door, I strained to hear anything. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. From the other side, I could distinctly hear breathing, slow and deep, as if someone was on the other side of the wood, listening to me as well. I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I returned to my room and locked the door. I was at a loss. Call the police? Press the receptionist further? It all seemed so ridiculous. I sat up in bed, trying to think clearly, when the sound came again, much louder this time. It was as if someone was striking the wall with something heavy, with such force that the pictures hanging on my side of the room quivered. I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. The unsettling events of the night had left me with no choice. Just as I had settled back at my desk, having barely finished recounting the peculiar situation, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside my door. I swung the door open, anticipating the presence of either the receptionist or a guest, yet the hallway stood deserted. Nonetheless, something was amiss. The door to room 206 was ajar. I stood paralyzed, uncertain of my next move, before deciding to investigate. The hallway's dim light partially illuminated the room's interior, revealing it to be vacant. There were no suitcases, no trace indicating someone's presence. Yet, on the floor near the bed, a dark stain caught my eye, though from my vantage point, I couldn't discern its nature. It appeared moist, and my mind instantly conjured images of blood. My breath quickened as I retreated slowly, closing my door and barricading it with anything within reach, a chair, my suitcase, anything that might offer a semblance of security. Resolving to remain vigilant throughout the night, I awaited the dawn to escape that unsettling place. However, the disturbances persisted. Now, the noises seemed to emanate from directly above me, as if someone paced back and forth on the roof. I gazed upward, entranced, as the footsteps occasionally halted just above where I sat. The sound of breathing returned, now unmistakable, as though no barrier separated us. The night stretched on interminably, each sound and rustle making me startle. As daylight finally crept in, I hurriedly gathered my belongings and descended to the reception desk. The receptionist regarded me with surprise, taken aback by my early appearance, but I remained silent as I returned the key to him and walked towards the parking lot, deliberately avoiding a glance back. Before leaving, I couldn't resist taking one final look at the hotel from the car. From one of the second-floor windows, I noticed a figure observing me. Although I couldn't discern their face, I felt certain it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I accelerated quickly and never looked back. Months have passed since that evening, yet it continues to haunt me. I never discovered what transpired in that room, nor do I wish to. However, whenever I hear footsteps breaking the silence of the night, I question whether I truly escaped or if something from that place has followed me. Relocating to a new neighborhood always brings a sense of renewal. After spending several years in a small downtown apartment, I craved a change. So, when I found an affordable house in the suburbs, I didn't hesitate. It was a peaceful area with tree-lined streets and a sense of community that seemed straight out of a postcard. I thought it would be the ideal place to begin anew, far from the stress and monotony that had been my constant companions for years. The first few days were exactly as I had envisioned, utter tranquility. My neighbors appeared friendly, albeit somewhat reserved, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was a constant melody replacing the city's hustle and bustle. Among them was a man I initially didn't pay much attention to. His name was Alberto, and he lived in the adjacent house. He was around 40 years old, with an unremarkable appearance that was easily forgettable. I would occasionally see him tending to his garden or absorbed in a book on the porch. We exchanged only a brief nod, nothing more. It all started so subtly that, at first, I dismissed it. One morning, as I left the house for work, I noticed Alberto on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He was watching me, which seemed perfectly normal. After all, we all glance at our neighbors occasionally. Yet, as I entered my car and turned my head, he continued to watch me, motionless, his gaze lingering until I rounded the corner. As the days went by, I began to pick up on subtle details that unsettled me. Alberto seemed to be perpetually around. If I went out to water my garden, he would be sweeping his driveway. If I returned home late from work, his silhouette was framed against the glow of his window, seemingly awaiting my return. Even during my morning runs, I would find him ambling along the same path. Initially, I dismissed these as mere coincidences. After all, we were neighbors. However, the coincidences soon felt too deliberate. One evening at dinner, I noticed something peculiar. The lights in his house were off, save for a faint glow emanating from a second-floor window, the one that faced directly into my dining room. It was as if someone was observing me. I turned off my own lights to get a better view, but I couldn't discern anything. Nonetheless, the unsettling sensation of being watched clung to me, like a cold weight on my chest. The situation took a decisive turn on a Saturday. I had planned to spend the day at home, organizing my office. I was savoring the solitude of my own space when, around noon, a knock on the door startled me. It was the mailman, delivering a package addressed to me. After signing for it, I opened the box to discover something that sent a shiver down my spine. A photograph encased in a frame, featuring me. It wasn't a recent snapshot but one taken years ago, back when I resided in an apartment downtown. This was a photograph I had no recollection of posing for, an image captured in a setting I couldn't recognize. As dusk fell, my fear morphed into paranoia. Nights brought with them unsettling noises outside my house. The creaking of branches and the subtle sound of footsteps on the pavement. Each time I peered through the window, no one was there, yet the sensation of being observed clung to me persistently. I began to lock all the doors and check the windows thrice before retiring to bed. My life, which had led me to this neighborhood in search of tranquility, seemed to be unraveling. Determined to confront my suspicions, I ventured into the yard one day while Alberto was busy sweeping his driveway. I attempted to engage him in light conversation, but his demeanor was odd. Although nothing he said was outright alarming, his evasive manner, the peculiar tone of his voice, and especially the way his gaze never wavered from mine, left me uneasy. After a few minutes, I retreated into my house, feeling more exposed than ever before. That night marked the climax of my growing apprehension. Exhausted from the day, I went to bed early. I cannot recall how long I had been asleep when a metallic clanging from WN stairs jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I lay still in bed, straining to listen. Listening intently, I heard another noise, clearer this time, as if someone was attempting to pick a lock. Rising cautiously to avoid making any sound, I seized a baseball bat from the closet and descended the stairs, my heart pounding. Upon reaching the living room, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. The cold night air crept through the opening, bringing with it an eerie silence. I meticulously checked every corner of the first floor but found no one. After securing the door and wedging a chair against it, I returned to my room, but sleep eluded me. The following morning, I discovered something that made my stomach twist with unease. On the dining room table lay a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there the night before. Unfolding it, I read a sentence scrawled in tight letters. "I'm always around." My hands trembled as I immediately called the police. When they arrived, they conducted a thorough search of my house and the surrounding neighborhood but found nothing suspicious. I recounted my experiences with Alberto, how he seemed to be omnipresent, and mentioned the unsettling photograph I had received. They assured me they would investigate, but their tone suggested they didn't take my concerns seriously. To them, he was merely an eccentric neighbor, and they believed I was overreacting. Nevertheless, my instincts screamed that something was amiss. Determined to uncover the truth, I resolved to investigate on my own. I began observing Alberto, tracking his movements from the shadows of my window. I discovered he seldom left his house, except for walks that curiously coincided with my own activities. One night, I witnessed him carrying a box to his car before driving out of the neighborhood. I trailed him from a prudent distance until he halted at a deserted warehouse. I observed him enter with the box, yet I lacked the nerve to get closer. The subsequent days turned into a nightmare, as I sensed Alberto was aware that I had shadowed him. His demeanor grew increasingly intrusive. One evening, upon returning home, I discovered the front door standing wide open. Although nothing appeared to have been taken, the mere fact that someone had been inside was enough to persuade me that I needed to leave. I contacted a locksmith to replace the locks and began packing my belongings. That final night in the house was the most harrowing. I was nearly finished stowing away my possessions when I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. I was certain no one else was in the house. Grabbing a baseball bat for protection, I swung the door open but found nothing there. I turned off all the lights and barricaded myself in my room, hoping the night would pass swiftly. When I eventually moved out, I exhaled with relief, believing I had left everything, including Alberto, behind. However, weeks later, as I unpacked in my new residence, I stumbled upon something that tied my stomach in knots. A note identical to the one I had previously discovered in my dining room, bearing the same chilling words. "I am always near." Since then, I have lived with the perpetual sensation of being watched, convinced that Alberto never ceased tracking me. I have no idea how, but it seems that regardless of where I go, he invariably finds a way to remain nearby. I've never been fond of parties, always considering them a futile endeavor, merely an excuse for people to indulge in alcohol and utter things they would not otherwise say. Despite my usual reluctance to speak up, when the invitation to the party arrived, my curiosity overpowered my skepticism. This wasn't just any gathering, it was an exclusive, private event, one of those that promised the unattainable. Only those selected, proclaimed the black envelope adorned with golden lettering. It appeared more as a challenge than a mere invitation, and I have always relished accepting challenges. The card IVED was entirely anonymous, lacking any signature or reference point, containing only an address and a date. There was no way to determine who was orchestrating this, yet something within me urged me to attend. Perhaps I was seeking something different, something to break the monotony, or maybe I simply yearned to uncover the mystery behind that enigmatic invitation. That evening, I made my way to the designated location. An old building in the heart of the city, the kind of structure seemingly forgotten by time. Its tall, barred windows imparted a sense of seclusion from the outside world. The mansion, dilapidated and nearly opaque, felt like an echo from the past. Upon my arrival, the iron gate stood ajar, and a dim light emanated from within, as if beckoning me to enter. The atmosphere was disquieting, yet I chose to disregard it. With determined steps, I ventured inside and discovered a small hallway adorned with antique furniture, all draped in white sheets. The walls were lined with portraits that appeared to silently observe me. A few steps further, I reached a spacious room dimly lit, more so than I had anticipated. Music could be faintly heard in the distance. In the distance, a faint, low thrum resonated softly, echoing throughout the background of the room. People were scattered around, dressed elegantly, as if we were attending a grand gala. Yet, there was something in the air that felt out of place. The faces of the attendees appeared slightly off, their gestures rigid, and their eyes devoid of any expression. No one was smiling, and conversations were scarce. The atmosphere was charged with an invisible tension, as though everyone was anticipating something. As I ventured further into the room, an unsettling feeling nagged at me, though I couldn't quite articulate it. Making my way to the drinks table, I hoped to ease my nerves before attempting to engage with the hosts or other guests. However, my path was intercepted by a tall man clad in a dark suit and black tie. His face was expressionless, yet his eyes seemed to scrutinize me intently. He gazed at me for a few seconds, evaluating my presence, then silently turned away, permitting me to proceed. I picked up a glass of what seemed to be whiskey, but the drink tasted unlike anything I had encountered before, bitter, with an almost metallic tang. Deciding I didn't want to know what it was, I set it aside and began to observe the attendees more closely. It seemed everyone was there with a shared purpose, yet no one engaged in conversation, nor did they get too close to one another. It was as if they were ensnared in a collective trance. Suddenly, the music ceased, and a figure emerged on the stage at the back of the room. The man was tall and wore a black cloak seemed to meld seamlessly with the surrounding darkness, while his face was concealed by a golden mask, simple yet sophisticated. His presence was so commanding that the entire room descended into an absolute hush. Nobody stirred, not a single breath was drawn. He merely stood there, waiting. Moments later, the figure lifted an arm, and everything around him began to shift in a peculiar manner. In the distance, I observed the mansion's doors gradually closing, accompanied by a metallic click that resonated through the room. The chilling sound of the locks engaging sent a shiver down my spine. It was at that moment I realized something was terribly amiss. Though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what, the atmosphere had turned utterly oppressive, as if I had been ensnared in an invisible spider's web. A pair of men clad in dark suits started approaching the guests, myself included. Without uttering a word, one of them gently tapped my shoulder, gesturing for me to follow. Initially, I hesitated, but there was something in his eyes that suggested it would be unwise to refuse. Nevertheless, I endeavored to stay composed. If something peculiar was unfolding, I needed to discern what it was before taking any action. I was led to a room in the mansion's east wing, where the atmosphere grew even more unsettling. The walls were bare stone, and the air was thick, laden with a strange humidity. In the center of the room, a circle was drawn with chalk on the floor, surrounded by flickering candles. The other guests were already present, lined up along the room's length, observing in utter silence. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. I was pushed into the center of the circle, and at that moment, the tension was palpable. The enigmatic figure in the golden mask emerged once more, this time flanked by two additional men. His unwavering and intense gaze swept across everyone present, but this time, it fixated on me. A chill raced down my spine, yet I endeavored to maintain my composure. The figure lifted his hands and, with a subtle gesture, indicated the circle of candles. The men who had accompanied me began to withdraw, leaving me isolated in the center while the others remained stationary. A cold sweat started to bead on my forehead as a sense of impending doom loomed. Something beyond my comprehension was about to transpire. It was then that I realized this was no ordinary gathering, it was a ritual. The man in the golden mask began to murmur in an unfamiliar tongue, his voice reverberating through the room like a mesmerizing chant that seemed to invade my thoughts. As he spoke, the candlelight intensified, casting peculiar shadows on the walls. The guests, who had previously appeared rigid and aloof, began to move slowly into the circle, each with a fixed, vacant expression as if governed by an external force. At that moment, I felt a tug on my wrist. Glancing down, I discovered that one of the men who had been observing had wrapped a rope around my arm. Before I could react, a sharp needle pierced my skin, injecting a substance into my system. Pain surged through me like an electric current, and my vision became hazy. I collapsed to my knees as everything around me began to whirl. The masked leader's murmuring grew more intense, and the shadows seemed to. I struggled to think clearly as my limbs moved of their own accord. The poison injected into my veins had left me feeble and disoriented. I watched as the other attendants began to encircle me, brandishing knives, daggers, and unfamiliar tools. I was painfully aware of what was about to transpire. There was no turning back. Somehow, I summoned the strength to act before the next phase of the ritual commenced. In a desperate bid to regain my composure, I seized the knife meant for me, severed the ropes that bound me, and hurled myself aside. Chaos erupted in the room, filled with screams and confusion as they scrambled to catch up with me. I fled without daring to glance back, rushing through the dim corridors of the mansion. Their footsteps echoed behind me, and the heavy air made breathing a struggle. I reached the front door, pounding on it with all my strength. Although the gate was locked, I refused to give up. At last, I managed to force it open, stepping out into the night's enveloping darkness. I vanished into the shadows, running until my legs could carry me no further. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memories of that harrowing night. No one, not even the police, could locate the mansion. It vanished as if it had never been there. Though my life now appears ordinary, the scars from that night continue to haunt me. Occasionally, as I walk down the street, I sense eyes upon me from the shadows. The most unsettling part is that despite my efforts to forget, the image of the man with the golden mask relentlessly invades my dreams, haunting me every time I close my eyes. I sense their presence nearby, waiting for me. It was an afternoon like any other, or at least that's what I believed as I headed home. The workday had been grueling, and the thought of unwinding on my couch with a steaming cup of coffee and the cherished silence was all I craved at that moment. However, as I neared the entrance to my house, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but something in the atmosphere prevented me from feeling completely at ease. Approaching the door, the sensation intensified, like a weight pressing on my chest. My home has always been my sanctuary. I reside in a peaceful neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. A place where people know one another, where the community seems to be cloaked in a benevolent anonymity. Yet, something about that day felt off. I don't know if it was the faint rustle in the air or a fleeting glimpse at the corner of my eye, but something made me glance toward the living room window just in time to catch sight of a figure. A shadow, a presence, on the edge of my vision near the bushes in the garden. Initially, I thought it might be a trick of the light, an illusion created by the branches swaying in the breeze. But upon closer examination, the figure remained immobile. It was a man standing perfectly still, watching my house. I couldn't discern his features clearly, as he was shrouded in darkness, but the outline of his form was distinct enough to ignite a sense of panic within me. I halted abruptly, my breathing quickened uncontrollably, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, staring at that figure. I could not discern it clearly, but an unsettling sensation in my stomach warned me to stay away. Despite my curiosity compelling me to do the opposite, the urge to comprehend the situation overpowered my apprehension. I hesitantly took a step toward the door, dreading that upon opening it, the man might either approach or, even worse, vanish without a trace. I was unsure of what awaited me, but an inner voice insisted I pay attention to what was unfolding. As I exited, I closed the door behind me, and the lock's click resounded loudly, as if someone miles away could hear it. My heart thumped in my ears while I advanced toward the garden, my gaze fixed on the shadow. Oddly, I felt as though I was being observed, even before confirming whether that figure had indeed noticed me. Upon reaching the garden's edge, the figure remained, unmoving. I could barely discern any details, but there was no mistaking it. A tall man in a dark overcoat stood as still as a statue. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Who was this individual? What were his intentions? He did not appear to be attempting to break into my home, nor did he seem poised to take any overt actions. He was simply observing. The unease within me intensified, and I felt a tightness in my chest, as though someone were compressing my lungs. I concluded that the prudent course of action was to return inside and contact the authorities. I was ill-equipped to confront a stranger, especially amid such an ambiguous situation. But as I turned to leave, a sound reached my ears, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, as if the floorboards groaned beneath the weight of something, prompting me to spin around swiftly, expecting to find a stray animal or perhaps a gust of wind at play. Yet, there it was, a figure, now slightly nearer, having taken a step toward me without the faintest whisper of sound. I hadn't witnessed its movement, but it had undeniably drawn one step closer. Adrenaline surged through my veins, transforming my fear into an urgent compulsion to escape. I dashed toward the door, the sensation that the shadowy figure was in pursuit lingering in my mind, though there was no noise to confirm its advance. Upon entering, I made a point to secure everything behind me, as if that could somehow offer me solace. I stood before the door, my breath ragged, hands slick with sweat gripping the doorknob, hoping that a glance through the window wouldn't reveal him once more. But there he was, standing right outside my window. The darkness of night largely obscured him, yet his eyes emitted a faint glow, as though he was staring directly at me. There was no mistaking that he had noticed me. A cold sweat trickled down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tear my gaze from those eyes, which exuded an unsettling tranquility. He uttered not a word, nor did he stir, simply observing me for what felt like an eternity. The figure remained unmoving, even as I drew the window curtains closed. A wave of despair washed over me, clouding my thoughts. What did it want from me? Why was it observing me? Who was it? I reached out to the police, but when I recounted what I had encountered, they dismissed my account. The police assured me it was likely a prank or the antics of an eccentric neighbor. Nevertheless, they assured me they would dispatch an officer to patrol the vicinity. I expressed my gratitude, even though I knew deep down it did nothing to alleviate my fears. How could an intruder have entered my yard without being detected? And why had he ventured so close to my home? The wait felt interminable. Once I was finally alone in my house that night, an insistent fear clung to me. I incessantly peered out the windows, checking for any sign of the man, to see if he had moved. Yet, I saw nothing but the enveloping darkness. Despite this, his presence lingered, a certainty that he had not vanished. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak, every sound within the house heightened my alertness. I anxiously gazed out the window, hoping not to see the figure again, even though the last thing I truly wanted was to encounter him. Time dragged on, oppressively slow, as fear consumed me. Yet, he never returned. The following day, when the police finally arrived, I led them to the garden. There were no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. They suggested it was likely an error on my part, a simple misunderstanding. They offered a reassuring pat on my back before leaving me with the unsettling feeling that everything I had experienced that night was merely a figment of my imagination. However, the emptiness in my chest lingered. In the days that followed, life resumed its usual course. No one seemed to have noticed anything unusual. The neighbors refrained from discussing any shadowy figures, and there was no news of anything out of the ordinary. Despite this, I remained acutely aware of what had occurred. I had seen, I had felt, and most importantly, I knew I wasn't mistaken. I did not encounter the shadowy figure again, but an unsettling sensation enveloped my existence. I began to feel as though I was under constant surveillance. At times, as I strolled down the street, it seemed as if someone was trailing me, yet when I turned around, no one was there. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. It was those invisible stares that I cannot adequately describe but that left me feeling exposed. To this day, I am unable to explain what transpired that night. I have no idea who the man in the shadows was or why he appeared. I might never discover those answers, but one thing is certain. Since that night, I have been unable to shake the sensation that something is observing me, that this presence has not vanished. Occasionally, as I walk along the street without forewarning, I sense someone crossing my path, and I wonder if it's him or if he will ever reappear. I had been driving for countless hours. The road trip seemed interminable. Although the view of the shifting landscapes through the window was breathtaking, my mind was weary. I had planned to pause along the way, grab a bite to eat, and stretch my legs. The road signs pointed to a quaint town just a few miles ahead, and I decided it would be the perfect spot to stop. The town's entrance was unassuming, much like many others I had passed through during my travels. A couple of aged buildings and dirt roads gave the place a quiet, almost timeless feel. The streets were sparsely populated, which didn't surprise me much. I was accustomed to these towns far removed from the city. After all, they were typical places where time seemed to stand still. The travelers who stopped here rarely lingered, merely passing through. It was during such a fleeting moment that I noticed the restaurant. It occupied a prominent corner on the main street, a red brick structure with expansive windows that exuded a sense of warmth and coziness. The sign on the facade read, El Refugio, a name that felt inviting and full of promise. In need of a place to unwind, sip a hot beverage, and relax, I decided to enter without much deliberation. As I pushed open the door, a small bell chimed softly, yet no one responded. Inside, the restaurant was completely deserted. The dim lighting emanated from lamps suspended from the ceiling, and the decor was simple, featuring rustic wooden tables and worn leather chairs. Nothing in the ambiance seemed particularly off-putting, yet the lack of patrons struck me as peculiar. I chose a spot near the window, where the silence was even more profound than I had anticipated. Glancing around, I searched for a waiter, but there was no trace of any staff. The air was still, devoid of the usual background hum of distant conversations or the clinking of cutlery. Only the faint buzzing of the lights interrupted the quiet. Not wanting to linger idly, I retrieved my phone to check my messages, only to find there was no signal, no internet, no calls, nothing. Although slightly unsettling, I dismissed it, attributing it to the town's likely poor reception, something not unfamiliar from my past travels. A few minutes later, the sound of gentle footsteps on the wooden floor caught my attention. I looked up to see a man emerge from the shadows of the kitchen, clad in a white shirt and apron. His face was aged. It's hard to decipher his almost expressionless demeanor. He didn't appear startled to find me there. Quite the opposite, he approached my table with deliberate slowness, his gaze unwaveringly fixed upon me. He gestured for me to sit, not with words, but with a simple wave of his hand. I observed him cautiously as he made his way to the bar, where he seemed to have left something behind, a small notebook or perhaps a pad. Meanwhile, the restaurant remained empty, devoid of other employees, with no one else in sight except for him and me. I felt a sense of unease but chose not to succumb to paranoia. After all, it was merely an empty restaurant, and perhaps the few patrons in town simply didn't share my schedule. Yet, as time passed, something began to feel peculiar. The man's eyes never wavered from me. Every time I looked away, I could sense his gaze drilling into the back of my neck. It was an oppressive sensation, as though I was under scrutiny, being examined. Even when I glanced at my phone, which frustratingly had no signal, I could feel his eyes lingering on me. The waiter returned silently, placing a glass of water on the table without uttering a single word, nor making direct eye contact. His face remained impassive, almost operating on autopilot. Who was this individual, and why wasn't he speaking to me? The sense of discomfort intensified. I cast a hopeful glance toward the kitchen, yearning to see some sort of activity, but there was nothing, not the clatter of utensils, nor the hum of a stove. The place seemed abandoned, as if everything were frozen in time. I couldn't fathom how a restaurant could function this way. The most perplexing aspect was the complete absence of any food. There were no signs of anyone having dined there, not even empty plates or traces of previous meals. Everything remained untouched, as if time had frozen in that place. I decided to order something to eat in an attempt to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. The waiter seemed prepared to head to the kitchen, yet he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on me as if anticipating my order without needing to ask. After a protracted moment, I nodded and gestured toward the menu on the table, quietly requesting, "Something light, please, more out of court." ESY than genuine interest. He acknowledged my request with a slow nod, his expression unchanged, and made his way to the kitchen. As he departed, I noticed another figure moving in the dim light beyond the kitchen's threshold. It appeared to be another person, but I couldn't discern any features, only a shadow flitting behind the kitchen window. Was there another employee there? Why hadn't this person come out to greet me or at least extend a welcome? A renewed sense of discomfort washed over me, more intense than before. I was all alone, and although the waiter didn't seem to harbor ill intentions, something about his demeanor unsettled me. His movements, his gaze, everything about him felt detached, as if he were physically present but mentally elsewhere. Time dragged on, and through the window, I watched as the daylight waned and night began to cloak the surroundings. I checked my watch. It had been over 30 minutes since the waiter had vanished into the kitchen. Where was my meal? Suddenly, an unsettling sensation washed over me, as if unseen eyes were scrutinizing me from every corner of the restaurant. The gaze from the kitchen, the figure I had glimpsed earlier in motion, and now beyond the bar, the silhouette of a man emerged once more. Was it the same waiter? I couldn't be certain. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast by the bar, yet what unsettled me more was his rigid stance, as if anticipating something or someone. My breathing became erratic. Should I leave? An inner voice urged me to rise, to escape and never look back, but dread held me captive. The sensation of being observed, the way each movement within the restaurant seemed expertly choreographed, ensnared me. Each time I considered leaving, an invisible force seemed to restrain me from taking the next step. Eventually, the waiter reappeared, this time bearing a dish. He placed it on the table before me without uttering a word. I glanced at it quickly. It was a simple, almost rudimentary meal, yet something about it deepened my unease. How could an empty establishment offer something so precisely, so meticulously crafted without any explanation? The food lay before me, but my hunger had vanished. I couldn't gaze at it without a creeping sense that something was amiss. It was then that I noticed a detail that sent a shiver down my spine. As the waiter slowly retreated towards the kitchen, I noticed the figure behind the bar once again, the same shadow, now advancing toward me. As it drew closer, the air seemed to grow heavy and oppressive. Each step felt as if it were pulling me inexorably toward an unavoidable confrontation. I rose swiftly from the table, my heart thundering within my chest. As I glanced towards the door, it was closed, and suddenly, the lights extinguished all at once. The restaurant, which had been merely unsettling moments before, transformed into a silent prison. There was no way out, no escape. I turned around, seeking answers in the waiter's eyes, but his face was not human. I couldn't recall the last time I felt so utterly alone. The sensation was akin to being lost in a forest, enveloped by the ceaseless rustling of leaves and branches, which should have unsettled me, yet it didn't. Strangely, I felt at ease, even relaxed. It was a simple walk, a leisurely stroll along a familiar trail, but something in the atmosphere suggested that today would differ from the others. Perhaps it was the unusually profound silence or the sun's struggle to pierce through the canopy of treetops. Something was undeniably amiss. I found myself on the dirt path that meandered through the forest, a route I had traversed countless times without a hint of trepidation. I had always cherished solitary walks, the serenity, the solitude, the chance to disconnect from the clamor of urban life. Here in the woods, I could lose myself in contemplation, set my worries aside, and feel as distant from the world as the stars. As I continued, the forest's NDS seemed to amplify, but not in the tranquil, natural manner I expected. There was an underlying dissonance within the noise, something that didn't belong, as the crunching of dry leaves underfoot. Beneath my boots, the distant chirping of birds seemed unusually amplified by a peculiar tension in the air. The path grew increasingly narrow as I proceeded, with tree branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that barely permitted sunlight to filter through. The sensation of claustrophobia intensified with each step, yet I chose to press on. This was not my first time traversing this route, and nothing suggested that anything could go awry. Abruptly, the pressure in the atmosphere heightened, and I detected footsteps in the distance. Although I initially assumed they belonged to animals, the sound was too precise, too human. I halted momentarily, attempting to pinpoint the noise's origin. It was a whisper, nearly inaudible, but unmistakably present. I found myself encircled by shadows and trees that seemed more dense, and for a fleeting moment, I sensed that something, or someone, was observing me, though I could see nothing. Then I saw them. They emerged from the trees, stepping out from the side of the trail as if they had been anticipating my arrival. They were a group of men, perhaps 4 or 5, all clad in dark attire and carrying large backpacks. They wore tactical gear, complete with heavy vests and boots. There was something bewildering about their presence. They did not resemble ordinary hikers. Their gazes were icy and calculating, and their movements were rigid, as if driven by a specific intent. One of them advanced and fixed his stare on me while the others subtly spread out, encircling me. I didn't immediately grasp the situation. I thought it might be some sort of prank. Or perhaps individuals who had lost their way in the forest, yet there was something peculiar about their demeanor. They remained silent and moved in an unnaturally quiet and observant manner. My initial instinct was to retreat, but an inexplicable intuition held me in place, leaving me feeling ensnared. The men encircled me, not hastily, but with a vigilance that never wavered. Their presence was intensely suffocating. At that moment, the man nearest to me spoke, though his words defied my expectations. It wasn't a question, nor was it a command. Instead, it was something that heightened my discomfort. "We found you," he declared. Instantly, his tone made it clear that this was far from a greeting. The atmosphere grew denser, and I was bewildered by the unfolding events, feeling as though escape was impossible. There was no indication that this was a misunderstanding. These men did not resemble lost wanderers or tourists. There was a far more sinister quality in their stare, in the way they advanced. It seemed as though they were evaluating me. One of them retrieved a crumpled map from his backpack and unfurled it before me, pointing to an area I couldn't recognize. The details were indistinct, yet his finger persistently indicated a specific spot within the forest. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't look, that I should take action, but my body was immobilized, as if entranced. Who were these men? Why were they observing me in such a manner? And why were they mistaking me for someone else? "You've gotten yourself. You're delving into something beyond your comprehension," remarked another of the men, as if stating the obvious. I sensed no compulsion to question them, aware that any answers would likely be ambiguous. I had no desire to unravel the mystery before me. My breathing grew heavy, my heart raced, and adrenaline surged through my veins. My mind screamed at me to flee, yet I found myself ensnared between them and the dense forest foliage. My gaze was fixed on the map one of them held. His finger moved deliberately across the paper, reinforcing the notion that I was in the wrong place. An instinct warned me that these men were more than mere hikers. They had a purpose, and it boded no good for me. For a brief moment, one man stepped back a couple of paces, and I sensed an opportunity to escape. Without hesitation, I began moving swiftly toward the clearing ahead. My legs almost tangled with the roots, fear clouding my awareness of each step. However, before I could cover more than a few meters, one of the men barred my way. The unexpected nature of it struck me immediately. Though the man was no taller than I, his presence was overpowering. His gaze pierced through me, and though he remained silent, his eyes conveyed an unsettling depth of understanding. Suddenly, a peculiar thought flitted through my mind. It wasn't me they were after. The feeling that this was all absurdity lingered. Hooked by a gripping tension, I found myself questioning who these individuals were and what they desired from me. Every action they took seemed meticulously choreographed, as if they were scrutinizing my every gesture, predicting my next step. I was ensnared in a game whose rules were beyond my comprehension. The man before me lingered, his gaze fixed on me, while uncertainty hung in the air, dense and almost tangible. Then, as though nothing had occurred, he lifted his hand and signaled for the others to retreat. Without uttering another word, he pivoted and began to walk back toward the group, who followed him without objection, retracing the path they had arrived by. I stood there, watching as their silhouettes gradually vanished into the forest's dense canopy. Rooted to the spot, unsure of my next move and afraid to act, a cold sweat trickled down my spine as I struggled to steady my breath. What had transpired was an utter mystery. Why had they confused me with someone else? What were their intentions? I had no answers, only a myriad of questions and a haunting sense that this encounter might not be the end. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and branches, imbuing the forest with an eerier, more unsettling atmosphere than before. In my mind, a singular thought echoed relentlessly. It wasn't me they sought, but someone else. Perhaps for him, there would be no turning back. Sometimes, the seemingly trivial moments become the pivotal points that redefine one's life. I was neither a superstitious man nor a believer in omens or cosmic signs. Yet, there I was, at 3 o'clock in the morning, grappling with the inexplicable events of the night. Something deep within me signaled that my life was on the verge of a profound transformation. It was one of those serene evenings when everything seemed perfectly aligned, the crisp air, the luminous moon, and the mostly tranquil city after a long day at the office. I decided to pause at a local convenience store to pick up some water and cookies. I wasn't in any particular rush, and the corner shop was merely a couple of minutes away from my home. I cherished those late-night visits when the store was deserted, allowing me to wander among the aisles without the usual hustle and bustle. As I stepped inside, the doorbell chimed softly, a testament to the stillness within. The shop was a modest space, with products haphazardly arranged on shelves that lacked the precision of a well-organized store. The fluorescent lights flickered ever so slightly, while the air was infused with the faint aroma of coffee left to brew. The only other person present was the cashier, a young man sporting a bored expression, a common sight at this late hour. I headed to the beverage section with no particular thought in mind, grabbed a bottle of water, and selected some cookies on a whim. I was in the midst of paying when a figure materialized at the entrance. Initially, I paid little attention, assuming it was just another customer passing through. However, when I glanced up and saw the individual's face, I froze. It was a tall man clad in a black jacket, which seemed incongruous with the warm night. His face was partially obscured by a cap, and his stance was rigid and tense. His presence immediately unsettled me. Something about his cold, unwavering gaze put me on high alert, though I couldn't quite pinpoint the reason. The atmosphere shifted in an instant, yet the clerk at the counter remained unfazed, likely accustomed to the languid pace of the night. Perhaps he assumed the man was just another patron. My breathing accelerated slightly, a silent acknowledgement that something was amiss. Maybe it was the way the man surveyed the room, as if anticipating someone or something, or perhaps it was his failure to head toward the produce aisles like any typical customer. Instead, he lingered near the entrance, observing. Then, without warning, he pivoted and began striding toward the counter. The doorbell chimed once more as the man entered with a determined step, but what truly signaled that something peculiar was unfolding was the clerk's reaction. Though he didn't immediately raise his gaze, his expression shifted. For a fleeting moment, his eyes widened, as if he understood what was imminent. Suddenly, the store's atmosphere grew dense with palpable tension. That's when I heard it, the metallic clink of a gun being drawn from the man's jacket. Slowly, the clerk glanced up, and I discerned an emotion I previously missed: fear. With an unsettling calm, the man extracted a firearm from his jacket, aiming it skyward, yet the intent was unmistakable. I was the next target, and the motive remained an enigma. In that instant, the air within the space thickened, my mind racing at a frenetic pace, grappling with the question, what was I supposed to do? This marked the first occasion I had attempted to rob the establishment. The clerk remained motionless, and no one uttered a scream. The gun was now securely in the man's grasp, and his unwavering stare made me feel exposed, as if I were ensnared in a dream from which I could not awaken. My throat tightened, and a cold sweat trickled down my spine. It was peculiar because, despite the looming danger, the man appeared unhurried. He didn't rush directly to the cashier or demand money immediately. Instead, he stood silently, observing me. Part of me wanted to flee, yet another part understood it was futile. The man wasn't there to take the money. He was there for a different purpose. What transpired next caught me off guard. The man took a step toward the counter, and, as if it were a routine he'd performed countless times before, he placed the gun on the counter and began conversing with the teller in a composed manner, as if they were merely engaging in small talk. It was as if they were both following a script they were familiar with, but one I couldn't comprehend. Just follow the instructions, the man instructed the cashier in a voice so soft I could scarcely hear him. It felt as though everything around me was enclosed in a bubble, distant and oblivious. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the plastic bag sliding across the counter, and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat, yet I couldn't grasp what was unfolding. Something didn't align. Shortly after, the man started to walk toward me with a deliberate but unhurried pace, and my heart began to race. For a moment, it felt as though my legs were refusing to respond. Finding myself only able to stare at him, his face partially obscured by the cap, his eyes locked onto mine, I remained motionless, feeling inexplicably unable to move. He halted directly before me, and the intensity of his gaze, now sharply focused on mine, filled me with an unsettling sense of vulnerability. Thoughts of screaming or fleeing flitted through my mind, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the presence of the gun or the sheer intimidation of his demeanor that rendered any attempt to react futile. The man remained silent, merely observing me intently. Then, abruptly, he gestured with his hand. Initially, I was perplexed about his intentions, but upon noticing the gun, I understood. He was making a demand. Though I couldn't fully grasp it, an instinct warned me against resisting. Glancing towards the cashier, I noticed he too was complying with the man's directives. There was no effort to assist me or thwart the man's actions. He was simply executing the orders given. My breathing became labored, and the air felt insufficient. The man signaled for me to approach the counter, and despite myself, I moved forward mechanically, like a puppet on strings. What was unfolding? What did he plan to do to me? Each step felt more sluggish than the previous one, but as I finally reached the counter, the situation became clearer. The man was collecting a sum of money, and it dawned on me that he wasn't interested in my possessions. He neither desired my money nor anything else I carried. The gun in his grip remained steady, and his eyes never wavered from mine. As he gathered the coins and bills, he continued to fix his gaze squarely on me. Meeting my gaze, his voice was steady, yet carried the weight of an unspoken urgency. As I made my way to the basement, the echo of my footsteps seemed to resonate with an unsettling rhythm. The corridor leading to the basement was dimly lit, each step forward feeling like a descent into the unknown. The moment I entered the basement, a peculiar chill wrapped around me, almost as if the air itself was whispering secrets long forgotten. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but an unsettling aura permeated the room. The files were scattered, their disarray mirroring the chaos I felt within. Despite the clutter, I methodically began to sort through the documents, hoping to restore some semblance of order. Time slipped by unnoticed as I immersed myself in the task at hand. My mind occasionally drifted back to the incident at the store, replaying the man's expression in my thoughts. That empty smile lingered with me, an eerie reminder of how quickly life can change. It was as if the basement shared a similar aura of inevitability, a place where choices were made, and paths were altered. As I continued to work, a sense of resolve slowly emerged within me. The basement no longer felt like a place of dread but rather a space where I could confront my own fears. The memories of the store and the man's haunting smile would remain with me, but they no longer held the same power. With each filed paper and organized folder, I felt a small piece of myself being restored, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Staring directly into my eyes, usually, it wouldn't have bothered me. It was part of the job, after all. Being new to the company, I felt the pressure to demonstrate that I was capable of handling any task, no matter how trivial or unpleasant. Without a moment's hesitation, I made my way to the elevator. The peculiar thing was that as I entered the elevator, I observed something odd. There was no one else in the corridor. The area was deserted, as if all the employees had left early, as though that section of the building had been abandoned. The basement was located at the lowest level, nestled deep within the foundation of the structure. When the elevator doors parted, the air grew dense, the chill was biting, and a pungent odor of mold and dust assailed my senses. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting a gloomy hue over everything. The hallway appeared longer than it truly was, with walls adorned in damp stains. The documents I needed to examine were situated at the far end, among numerous shelves cluttered with papers in disarray. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about that basement unsettled me. Perhaps it was the utter silence or the sense that everything had been forgotten, consigned to a shadowy corner of the building. Something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. I began walking toward the shelves, searching for the reports I had been tasked to review, when a noise, initially faint, caused me to halt abruptly. It was a scratching sound, reminiscent of something or someone clawing at a wall, or worse, something out of place. I didn't pay it any heed. Initially, I didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just the noise from some pipes or the ventilation system. The basement was not a place I frequented, and the building's vibrations could be peculiar. However, I heard it again, this time louder and more distinct, a scraping sound followed by a light tapping. I froze, my heart beginning to race. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. The hallway remained empty, with the only source of illumination being the fluorescent light flickering incessantly. A sense of pressure settled in my chest, as though someone was watching me from the shadows. I tried to rationalize it as I always did, but something urged me not to dismiss it. Cautiously, I started to move toward the end of the hallway, drawn to the origin of that peculiar sound. My mind was on high alert, and each step felt heavier than the last. The feeling of unease only intensified as I reached the corner. There, I noticed a door I typically wouldn't have observed. It was slightly ajar, and a sliver of dim light seeped through the crack, illuminating the concrete floor. Approaching cautiously, I realized the sound had completely stopped, but the tension in the air was palpable. Perhaps it was a malfunctioning machine or a system requiring maintenance, I thought, yet I couldn't fathom why no one was there to address it. I pushed the door with my hand, and with a creak, it slowly swung open. What I discovered sent a chill through my bones. In the center of the room, crouched in a dark corner, was a human figure huddled over, almost in a fetal position, as if trapped in that confined space. His face, barely discernible in the dim light, was obscured by a tangle of unruly hair. I couldn't immediately identify what I was observing, but the fact that she was sprawled on the floor suggested to me that she might be unable to move. I attempted to retreat, but something held me in place. It felt as though my feet were anchored to the ground. My breathing turned erratic, and my eyes refused to look away from the figure before me. I had no idea who it was or how it had ended up there, but what unsettled me the most was the overwhelming sensation that neither I nor this room should exist in the basement of an office building. The figure, sensing my presence, slowly lifted its head. Its eyes, if they could still be called that, were bloodshot and lifeless, as if the figure had been trapped there for ages without sustenance. Its skin, pallid and grimy, was stretched taut over its bones. The expression on its face was beyond description, yet what convinced me that this was no dream or prank was the grimace of despair etched into its features. It seemed as if it wanted to speak but was unable to do so. Fear immobilized me, and although the urge to flee was overwhelming, something kept me rooted to the spot. I gradually crouched down, my mind screaming that I needed to escape before it was too late. However, the figure's gaze was fixed on me, and in a fleeting moment, I could hear its breathing, uneven, as if it was struggling to inhale. I edged a bit closer, and that's when I noticed something on the ground next to the figure. Gaze that seemed to pierce through me. What caught my attention was a piece of fabric that appeared to be torn, and nestled within its folds was something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a hand, but not just any hand. It was twisted, as if it had been bent in an unnatural direction, with the index finger ominously pointing at me. A cold sweat trickled down my back as her eyes locked onto mine, conveying a sense of desperation yet simultaneously warning me to keep my distance and not interfere. I couldn't disregard what lay before me. Turning my back and walking away as if nothing had transpired was simply not an option. My thoughts were swirling, leaving me with only one choice: to assist Sam. Eehow. My initial reaction was to dash for the door and call for help, but something held me back. I felt compelled to act differently, though I was uncertain of what to do. As I attempted to retreat, my feet stumbled over an object on the floor, sending me crashing down with a resounding thud. The figure instantly responded, rising and crawling toward me in an unnervingly unnatural manner that left me engulfed in fear. I tried to scream, yet not a single sound escaped my lips. My body was frozen in place, rendering me helpless as I watched her approach with erratic, otherworldly movements. Just then, the sound of elevator doors echoed from the floor above, causing the figure to halt. A few moments of complete silence ensued before the doors closed and the machine's noise faded away. Finally, my mind cleared enough for me to act. Without further hesitation, I scrambled to my feet, dashed to the door, and slammed it shut with all the strength I could muster. The figure remained, staring with that unsettling, relentless gaze. With an indescribable expression etched on my face, I didn't dare glance at it again. The only thing I understood at that moment was that something had transpired down there, something I wasn't meant to be aware of. I fled the basement as swiftly as I could, and upon reaching the main floor, a wave of relief washed over me. However, the sensation that something ominous lingered below, trapped in the basement, never abandoned me. The following day, I returned to work as if nothing unusual had occurred, but I couldn't shake the memory of the shadowy figure, the twisted hand, and the suffocating pressure of being confined with no means to call for assistance. The office was irrevocably changed for me. Though my boss never addressed what happened to the basement reports, I never ventured down there again.